I have no idea where this will lead us, but I have a definite feeling it will be a place both wonderful and strange.
Hello, and welcome to the Wonderful and Strange Twin Peaks Logcast. I'm Kalil, and with me today is the fix-all to my plaster of Paris.
I'm the abomination in the mixture, and David Lynch doesn't like me. I'm the professor. Unplugged Professor.
Today we're kicking off our coverage of the return special features on the Z to A collection. And first we're looking at the 5-hour-ish behind-the-scenes footage called Impressions, a journey behind the scenes of Twin Peaks. If you are interested in checking this out for yourself, it is on Disc 8. So like I said, about 5 hours. And just to kind of preface our talk today, the best thing, in my opinion, about seeing this special feature is seeing it, experiencing it, actually witnessing David Lynch and the cast and crew on the sets, visualizing it, and no amount of us talking about that can fully replace that effect. So if you're able to see that from the Z-Day collection, highly recommend you check it out for yourself.
There is plenty to it. Like, I've not seen really any collections that have this quantity of watching people do their thing on set.
And there's more coming up.
Even more coming up.
It feels so exhaustive in an interesting way because if you're anything like me and maybe not a huge fan of Twin Peaks The Return, I know, aghast, oh my god, but it could still be interesting to learn as like a case study. And I found myself really curious about what happened on the set to make Twin Peaks The Return the way it was, because love it, hate it, anywhere in between, Twin Peaks The Return is weird. It's a very strange thing. We're not even sure if it's a movie or a TV show. We don't know what this thing is.
Including this portion of the special features. Is this a movie or a TV show with multiple ranges of credits? It's a documentary?
Documentary series.
Documentary series.
Of shorts.
We will put...
But before we jump into all that fun and very groovy stuff, I wanted to ask you a question.
Yeah.
We have taken a short hiatus for about like a couple months since our last time we sat together to record like this.
Mm-hmm.
And in this time, we have not talked a ton about Twin Peaks.
We have not?
We've kind of put a pause on that. So my question for you, Professor, is now that a couple months have passed since you saw the end of Twin Peaks The Return, since you last witnessed that, what are your thoughts and feelings on Twin Peaks The Return and its finale? Has anything changed? Has anything maybe solidified in your mind as time has went on?
The most honest answer I can give to you is mostly nothing, but mostly just because there was a few personal things that popped up here and there, so my brain became a nothing sandwich for a bit, a little bit of a void to suck all the information that was in between. But looking back now, past that little point of void, it's something where I recall my time enjoying. It's something that I do not mind redissecting again, and if someone brings up The Return to me, it is something that I'd be intrigued in. It is still something that is fun to look back on, but is not too present or imposing on my day-to-day.
Mm-hmm. When someone brings up Twin Peaks, and I don't know if anyone has in the past couple months to make you think of it, but when someone just brings up Twin Peaks, do you think of The Return first or the original series?
Funnily enough, the first thing that I think of, this is a left turn of an answer, but it's the Welcome to Twin Peaks book. The one with the cherry pie onto it. And
the Access Guide.
The Access Guide, yes.
Really?
Genuinely.
Why do you think that is?
It's something where I think it's a bit of a bias going into a lot of the media that you and I have worked with and looked into, and it's just such a weird piece of material, so that when I hear Twin Peaks, that's just the first mental image.
Sure.
And sometimes it's like the first like weird fact that comes up, like that has to deal with like Big Ed eating a bunch of pancakes.
Right. Now, not just a bunch, an inhuman amount of pancakes. A lethal amount.
It's something that does not fail to put a smile on my face,
Sure.
and if that's something that is tied to Twin Peaks for me, I guess that's it. So
interesting.
I'm quirky, I guess.
Oh, wow, you're not like most other girls. So like 2 months later, though, right? You'd still say that Twin Peaks The Return is your favorite piece of Twin Peaks material?
Yes.
Even if it may not be your pick for the best.
It's not my pick for the best, but it is something that was fun to try to decode. It was a nice challenge for myself, and it was still something that I can look into and feel like if I view it again at either this stage or give myself a few years, I might come out with something a bit different, and that's kind of exciting to me. Meanwhile, I do feel fairly confident in some of my views with things such as Fire Walk With Me as well as the original series, but I do think they're very solid, and I will even argue that those are stronger.
For myself, 2 months later, I say most of my feelings have not changed a lot, although being away from the material has kind of mellowed me out. I'm not as immediately angsty and ready to fire away at things I don't like. But I will say that as time has gone on, I've watched more series. I recently been trying to get caught up on TV shows that I haven't been paying attention to. I watched Yellow Jackets recently, season 1 of that. And it's interesting, when I think about that, it's like, I also watched The Wire as well. And thinking about these other shows that, pretty acclaimed fan bases, whether it's old classic shows or more recent shows, Twin Peaks: The Return continues to be one of the most challenging, interesting, and different pieces of television, film, whatever you want to call it, in the sense that if I compare any other TV show to Twin Peaks: The Return, Twin Peaks: The Return seems like the weirder option no matter what I put in front of it.
Yeah.
If I put Lost in front of it, Lost makes more sense to me than Twin Peaks: The Return. And so there's a special place that I have to respect with Twin Peaks: The Return, that it is so different. It is so almost beyond compare of other shows that no matter what I stack next to it, I'm like, this is a different sort of breed. And when I look at other shows, it's like, I can critique certain aspects of maybe a certain season of The Wire, or maybe I think some things in Yellow Jackets were a little too heavy-handed or something. But the way I critique them is so different than the way I critique The Return, and that's something I'm still trying to figure out as time goes on and I watch more programs, is how I feel about it. Twin Peaks: The Return, its heights are higher than most things I ever see. Part 8 is still among the best things I've ever seen in any visual medium. But the lows are so low for me that Twin Peaks: The Return is such a frustrating experience to go back to, that when I think about, do I want to watch The Return again? It's going to be a while. And if I do, it's probably not going to be just on my own for fun. It's probably going to be that I'm watching it with someone else for the first time, like you. Not you specifically, but someone else, like a clone of you.
Is there going to be a sequel series to the podcast?
Professor, I didn't tell you this, but 3 years ago I cloned you.
Oh, no.
So there's a different... He's been in cold storage, and I just figured I'll bring him out when we're done with this finale and then end of March, and then we'll have a new renaissance. The Twin Peaks Wonderfuler and Stranger podcast, because I did tweak his DNA a little bit. He's got more quirks. He's even less like most other girls. He's a little different.
That's a dangerous amount of power you're playing with, Kalil.
Yeah. He also, for some reason, always talks like Jean Reno. I'm still trying to work out the kinks on that
so you made a better version of me.
It's kind of more improved.
It hurts, Kalil. It hurts that you improved on perfection.
So I think between our two different stances of how we feel about The Return, going into 5 hours of behind-the-scenes footage maybe is interesting to us in different ways. I'm looking at what went wrong somewhat, right? I'm looking at what happened here that maybe I didn't love. Was there something I can glean from the production that'll help me understand my feelings and untangle them? And maybe for you, it's more of a sense of intrigue as well, because even though you don't think it's like the best made show ever, it obviously compels you in a way.
Yes.
And I know you really appreciated seeing like the effects and kind of the artistic design of The Return.
Yes.
Like, this is probably a gold mine in some areas to see the actual makeup and effects being produced.
Especially things such as the practical effects, or hearing about the materials that are used, or just some of the techniques and the piping that occurs for things such as blood splatters and so on. It's outright a gold mine for those who are interested in the goings on behind the scenes with like the oddities that I feel are underrepresented. I think it's easy to put a face right up front in the respects of like saying like, this is like the ideal of the show, this is the best part about the show, but you can't really put like pipes on a poster board, you know? You can't really put pipes.
It's highlighting all the things that make it what it is that maybe don't get the direct attention and acclaim. They're not the forefront all the time. They're things in the background. This series, or whatever you want to call this 5-hour chunk, Impressions, A Journey Behind the Scenes of Twin Peaks, it does have an article on the Twin Peaks Wiki, and I wanted to just share how they describe this thing for the audience.
Proceed.
So, quote, Twin Peaks Wiki: narrated and scored in an abstract manner by Josef Maria Schaefers, the short films intercut hundreds of hours of footage with new aerial photography of many of the locations, both those used for filming and featured in the series. So that's kind of their little blurb at the start. They do refer to it as short films. So in terms of the overall structure, it's kind of loosely organized. They do chunk it based on shooting locations, largely, but it's not like it's following purely the chronology. I don't think so, right? Like I watched it once in its entirety, and I didn't get the sense that it's completely from the beginning of shooting to the end of shooting, although it is partly? Is that what you got out of it?
Actually, like, I've seen them jump around from time to time from what I was recalling. Like, some of them are clumped in together, like a significant portion of, like, Twin Peaks shootings are clumped into one slot. But for the life of me, I can't remember the one location that kind of just repeated itself over time. But there were instances of it. Like, there were two separate episodes that we were taking time inside of Vegas and so on. I know that they're not titled in that respect, unless you want to tell me the location of Two Blue Balls, which does show a fair amount of Philadelphia
it's set in New York in the show, but I don't think it was shot in New York.
No, wasn't it Philly? I'm pretty sure it was Philly.
Well, I'm assuming there's no reason to shoot it actually in New York. You just have some aerial shots in New York City, and you get the idea. But so in general, when you're watching this, it is a loose chronology, generally moving from earlier in production to later, although I don't think it's 100% in order that way.
It's never really committing to that.
Right. By the end, you are looking at mostly the ending stuff. But, of course, a lot of things are shot out of order, and you kind of get to see that as a viewer, which I think is interesting. The main voice you hear behind the narration is Josef Maria Schaefer's, who is kind of portrayed as like an outside observer, very abstract, poetic sort of musings. I liked that those broke up the larger, like 20-minute chunks of interviews and behind-the-scenes footage.
Yeah.
Although for myself, I don't have really a lot to say about the narration that was written for Josef Maria Schaefer's, who also did the music, by the way.
I think that the biggest part about the narrations, they are musings, but they are very absent musings that do not, for one, reach any like tangible conclusion by the end.
They don't really build in a particular way. If you were to jump in the timeline and, like, let's say you wanted to watch the third entry in the special features and not the first, you wouldn't be missing context necessarily for the narrations. They're not in order in a way.
I don't feel any real attachments to the narrations. I don't feel anything other than trying to translate them. But then at that point, I have just a fun point where I'm like, oh, these were fun metaphors. So it's something that I honestly probably could have done without. I think that generally the tracking shots and just letting those linger could have been more akin to something such as Twin Peaks: The Return.
With that music especially.
With the music especially, which was also handled by Josef. Josef is the one who is the primary credit. They did have some additional credits for some other artists included,
sound
but
design
it seems like the vast majority was handled by Josef, and there's a good talent there. There's a good talent in a lot of tracking shots, but I do think it takes away. I think it also sort of reminds me of how much this is like that documentary that is owned by these few people that were putting this together and so on. I think it also becomes apparent in these small little shots where they try to change the style and look of it. There's some effective points where they're switching camera lenses in the middle of the Audrey video, but for the majority of them, almost like every episode has a different filter put over it. So if you've ever seen like the music video Take On Me with that black and white visual style with like the lining of a person, I recall there was something like that that was just for a singular scene with some of the music that just felt like, oh, they added this effect, but it's not really being utilized that well. There's also a film graininess where you can tell that was put over like digital footage, or at the very least my eyes saw that, and it kept taking me out of the experience again and again and again.
Yeah, it felt like maybe the director was having some fun playing with some different tricks and trying some things out.
Which is great for the sake of experimentation, and I'm excited for them in that respect. I just don't think that it punched as much as, say, for example, the intention may have been.
I do think it's interesting. There are moments where audio will cut out or it'll become distorted. And I'm assuming that was done because certain information David Lynch or someone else involved in production didn't want it to be included in the documentary. Maybe they spoiled something or revealed something that they didn't want to say. I thought those moments were handled generally pretty well. It wasn't super jarring, but it almost felt a little bit mysterious because they would continue talking, but you don't actually hear what they're saying, or it would be, like I said, distorted in a way where it kind of made me more interested in the mystery of it and the elusiveness of it. So I do think in the audio editing of that worked out pretty nicely.
No, I think that the audio is probably the strongest part of the documentary series.
And Josef Schaefer's, there's not a lot I could find out. Like, not even really finding his music is kind of difficult online as well. But apparently he had done some of the music for the documentary David Lynch, The Art Life, which, as you may guess, is about David Lynch. And I do own that, and I've seen it once and probably want to cover that at some point in some way. Maybe for our YouTube channel, but he has worked with David Lynch around that same time, so I'm guessing that's maybe where the connection comes from.
Yeah.
And
there seems to be like some sort of personal connection at the very least, from what I recall from the quote from it. After the first episode was released, thanking DL, which I'm assuming is David Lynch,
right.
for once again living with my shadow.
Oh, I missed that.
Was it my shadow? Yeah, it was.
I
on
missed
the
that
text.
part, but
it was either with my shadow or in my shadow. But it was like a small bit of text before the credits started to roll, if you will.
As I was kind of searching in for more information on Josef Schaefer's, I ran across this Reddit thread where there was an interesting little quote that I wanted to share, and it's I'm gonna probably mispronounce this name, but it's by a user named Houston Young. On Reddit, and they said, quote, "As a German myself, I was a bit bewildered at the narration of these BTS, behind the scenes, I don't think it's the K-pop band, behind the scenes episodes. The best I've come up with to make sense of it is it is some sort of deadpan parody of a Werner Herzog documentary. Lynch likes Herzog, and the two have also collaborated before." And I bring this up in part because that was actually a German viewer and listener who might have more perspective on the accent there. But also because when my roommate walked in, he asked, well, like, that's not Herzog, is it? I'm like, no, but it's someone I think doing something similar. So I don't know if it's on purpose or not, but I'm not the only one, at least, who thinks that there might have been some sort of Werner Herzog going on here. My context for that is like the documentary Grizzly Man, where he has a very similar cadence in his delivery of tone. So maybe that was the intent, was to do a Werner Herzog tribute. Maybe that is just, the way he talks and it's incidental. But I thought that was interesting to kind of glean from that Reddit user.
Well, as far as our empirical evidence goes, we have 3 people who are thinking Herzog and 1 person inside this room who doesn't really know Herzog. So at this point, I think we just have to ask Herzog themselves. So were you able to contact Herzog by the time this podcast?
No, I think he's busy.
Oh, okay.
I think he's busy right now.
Okay.
While Werner Herzog may have been the director responsible for Aguirre, The Wrath of God, this Impression series is responsible for Chad, The Wrath of completely ruining any illusion of fiction that I have in me. It's a very unwieldy title, by the way. So when I was watching this, I don't know what your experiences were like, but one of the most consistent things that kept coming to my mind is just how much this breaks down the illusion of the fiction in the sense of seeing characters acting, out of character, so to speak, in between takes. One of the ones that stood out to me was Chad. He's not in there a lot, but when he's in there, I see the actor for Chad smiling in this like plain white t-shirt, just hanging out with Andy and Lucy's actors who also haven't changed yet for their scene. And they're just like casually having like a good time, smiling, talking, no worries whatsoever. And this is like right before they have to like lock him up and you're a bad man, Chad, and you give good police officers a bad name, but they're like just chilling and having a good time before. And like intellectually, I know that, the actor is not the same as the character, but Chad is such a thoroughly despicable character that to see the actor for him just having a good time, seeming like a good dude, friendly guy, is just pretty funny to me. Also, before I want to highlight, just make sure we highlight the outfit that Lucy's actor was wearing during that part, Kimmy Robertson, this like bright red outfit with like a blue pin. I couldn't tell if it was like a donut or something, but it was like the most Twin Peaksy outfit, standing right next to Andy and Chad's actors just wearing normal clothes.
I didn't even like see like normal clothes for Andy just because I'm so used to like, of course, like Andy is like the character, but still think about Andy always being inside the police attire. I see this actor in shorts. I'm thinking like, oh, summertime Andy. I didn't realize that. I didn't realize this variant.
Didn't know we had that skin unlocked.
It is. That's exactly how it feels like unlocking skins for characters that are just out of place.
Right. And then Kyle MacLachlan joking around right before shooting a Mr. C scene because I didn't know what Kyle MacLachlan's methods were. For all I know, he's a deep method actor and he has to pretend to be Mr. C for hours before the shoot. But no, he's like right before the camera rolls, he's joking, having a good time, talking like normal Kyle MacLachlan, and then you just kind of see him transform. I mean, the closest I ever saw him like really get into it was during the scene where he's going to be talking to Gordon Cole at the prison through like the glass, and you see him kind of sit there menacingly in the background while David's somewhere else on the set. But like that's probably because he was just getting ready to shoot minutes later. It doesn't seem like Kyle MacLachlan has to have a really big process to get in the mindset of Mr. C. I think he kind of just flips the switch, which is almost more impressive. You know?
It's very impressive. It's one of those cases. Method acting already is a very controversial thing inside the scope of
There are
Hollywood.
great method actors out there who do phenomenal work,
Yes.
but what told as a take on them and the people around them gets to be very difficult.
Not to mention the people that tend to work with them and the stories that can come up with. There are
Right.
trained actors who can, say, for example, wish for people to explore and try to reach those switches and just try to train their arts in a fashion that's going to be more safe for the environment around them, but have experienced workers in which, like, people who just try to go deep into the method acting that can't handle method acting.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, it's one of those cases where I'm thankful that we didn't have to worry about method acting from what we've seen inside of the scope with the return, because
Kyle
there's some
MacLachlan
very...
have to juggle 3 different personalities of method acting. Would you rather
Yeah.
deal with method acting Kyle MacLachlan as Mr. C or Dougie?
Okay.
Because both of them would
Are we-
cause obstructions on the set.
Are we talking about Dougie or Dougie Blacksuit?
I am talking about Dougie Blacksuit. Very good
Oh, no,
clarification.
I can handle Dougie Blacksuit easily.
I'm just saying he's like standing awkwardly in the way of shoots he's not supposed to be in. Everyone has to constantly move him away.
I just love the fact, for those who haven't seen the special features, is that they do organize the Dougies in, like, variants as well.
Right.
Dougie Blacksuit, as well as just Dougie, and also Agent C. All of these are separately recognized on things such as wrap-ups and
Yeah,
so
one
on
of the
in
recurring
features.
things you'll see is that David Lynch, when someone is finished with their shooting, when they've done with all their lines and everything with that actor's done, he'll do what's called a gather round, and he'll have everyone gather round, and he'll announce, usually with some sort of emotional comment, that it's a sad day, but also a great day, because all of the scenes with the phenomenal Diane are done. He'll have some sort of wrap-up with it.
Yes, and always addressing the name of the character.
Yes, and there's just this feeling of camaraderie that's built through that, and not just in those gather rounds, but in general, where it feels like a tightly knit team. A lot of what we see is disconnected. We don't see all the actors having moments together, but whenever we do, again with like the Chad, Andy, Lucy moment, we see them obviously getting along very well, having good conversation, especially the returning cast members who've known each other for like 3 decades by this point. There's a lot of friendships on set, I would say, and a lot of great correspondence between them, but also the way that it seems they get along with David Lynch. By all means, it seems like the vast majority of acting, the actors there have a very strong relationship with Lynch, really admire and respect him and get along with him well.
There's a heavy amount of, even if you are to say the essence of, like, people getting along in a format that we see through the special features and so on, even if you may, like, be skeptical in those ends, there's at least a great level of professionalism seen between the cast and crew throughout this, and those wrap-ups are a good example of that.
Yeah.
And even the sort of, I would call, levity when it comes to the variations of how many times Kyle MacLachlan has to be, like, congratulated for the wrap-ups.
Yeah, because every single character that he plays, which again, they separate the Dougies. There's also a great moment with Michael Horse. I'm not going to spoil all that into, but I thought he had some really great comments as well. I can't remember if it was during a wrap-up or just a general kind of speech moment.
It's hard not to adore Michael Horse,
Yeah,
and, like,
yeah.
the special feature does not stop that.
This show has some of the best casting I've ever encountered in a TV show.
Yeah.
And that Joanna Ray did a phenomenal job. Because obviously anyone who's returning for the original show, if they could get the returning cast member, they generally did. And those cast members did great. But if you look at like the new and original characters, I don't know if they could have had any better casting for most of them. Because I look at the Mitchum brothers, right? How much did Jim Belushi's casting just make that? And not just him. Obviously, the other Mitchum brother did a great job as well. But those two are cast so perfectly that if you had given the same script to a different actor, it might not reach that level. But I'm just imagining that scene where Jim Belushi is doing all those facial contortions about the pie in the box, handing that check over. Just giddy as a lamb on a pasture in the sunshine in a William Blake poem.
With that brilliant image in mind, yes, Jim Belushi did an absolute standout performance. There was a point that, though you may not agree with necessarily the choices that they made with Tony, it seems that even, like, emotionally, David Lynch was heavily getting into
Anthony Sinclair's character.
Sinclair's character, Tony.
Yes.
And there's...
Which we find out, by the way, because I know we had speculated on the podcast, that that white powder, David Lynch just says it's dandruff. And you could say that David Lynch's words don't matter, but I remember, I think I talked about this in the pod, and if I did, I'm going to share it right now. I remember seeing Reddit threads where people are talking about, that powder, that's the stuff. That's the stuff that Tammy has. It's actually a big thing in the whole entire return. And I think it was still when the return was airing, people were wondering, what's the powder?
Maybe it's the same thing.
Drugs?
Maybe it is the same thing. Tammy has the stuff. It means Tammy has dandruff.
Tammy needs Head and Shoulders, not sponsored.
Now, mind you, here's the thing. Like, the way that someone presents themselves naturally as opposed to their acting ability, those can differ greatly. The ways that you speak and the ways that you perform, they can be night and day for people, and that may still be the same with Tammy Preston. However, from the impression that I got from the way that her natural cadence was from what I saw from these special features, still sort of maybe it's a sunken cost fallacy in my mind, but I think it continues to reinforce that there was potential with her actress, but I do think that the heavy amount of flaws that I give to Tammy Preston lie into the scripting as well as
maybe
the
way
work.
that she was told to act. Maybe some of the direction there. And this is where I want to be very careful to give some praise with maybe some criticism. Joanna Ray, I'm going to credit for the vast majority of the casting here, because she's obviously credited as the main casting person here.
Yes.
But I look at, Hutch and Chantal, right? I know that from looking into it that Joanna Ray has connections to Quentin Tarantino. She's worked with him before. I understand maybe that how she got in touch with Tim Roth. And I'm just thinking, man, Tim Roth was such a great acquisition as Hutch. And I'm thinking that Jennifer Jason Leigh, such a great acquisition as Chantal. And those two have such an amazing chemistry together and are such great performers. Because I don't think Hutch and Chantal are that interesting, aside from the acting.
Which, mind you, one of my favorite moments probably from this was how the actor for Hutch was really hyping up the actress for Chantal before it was revealed Chantal was actually part of a hiring process in the past. But still the absolute hype of being yeah, no, you're gonna love her. And honestly, from her performance, it shows. She does very well in flying into the character.
What really makes them compelling, and I do enjoy their characters, are the performances.
Yeah.
If you had given lesser or, maybe not as apt actors for that particular role, I don't think it would be very much. So I just think the casting was great there. Also, just quickly highlighting, I think Bill Hastings, I've said a lot of praise before, but Matthew Lillard was perfect for that role and elevated it so much. And then also Bushnell Mullins, I don't think I give enough credit for his performer too, because I think that he does a really good job navigating these confusion of what's going on with Dougie from the position of being the boss. With this sort of boxing legacy. Yeah. I just think a lot of the new original characters are elevated so much from the script by their performances, and that's largely what makes them memorable of those performances.
Yeah.
They're great. Where you bring in the question with Tammy then is that I would guess, this is guessing, I don't know if there's any proof out there, that David Lynch brought her along, probably not Joanna Ray through the normal channels, because David Lynch had a relationship with that performer by having previously worked there on her music. So what I mean is that the performance we're most concerned about in the return, I don't think was casted by the main casting person. I'm going to assume David Lynch had brought her in. And you've also commented before, you're not really sold 100% on David Lynch's performance in the return.
Nope.
So I just wanted to kind of mention that I don't know if that's the casting problem here in the normal way. If you catch my drift.
I catch your drift.
But I just wanted to say that, yeah, watching this really made me remember and appreciate how much the actors do contribute to the return and really bring a lot of things in. Last thing I kind of want to mention as far as, fun moments, just seeing the actors out of character. I loved watching the Ike the Spike performer walk through the halls and practice stabbing and just seeming like, a really, normal, cool guy. And it's just the person who is maybe a stunt person or whatever, yeah, you just need to really push me against the wall and just keep stabbing. And they do that a couple times. And it's just this fun dynamic of him just casually walking through the halls practicing. And then of course we see the final product, which is so charged with this weird energy between the music and that was added to the track, but then also him running between the rooms and just attacking and slaughtering everyone. Seeing that being made was really interesting.
There's also this sort of weird dissonance that I believe that David Lynch wanted him to experience a certain anger, I believe it was anger as emotion.
I think that's what he said, yeah.
And he could just kind of comes off as mildly disappointed, oh.
Yeah, it doesn't read the way that I think David Lynch said, but I liked it. Yeah.
I love it.
I'm curious if when David Lynch saw the final footage for that or was, looking at it, did he think, oh, yes, that's exactly what I was looking for? Or did he think that's incredibly different? I love it. I'm curious which emotion we would have got from him from that. Just wondering. So one thing that you had speculated on during our podcast when I think it was part 1 for the return, you made a comment that I think it was the curtains when our black and white zone scene was happening with Dale Cooper talking to, at that point, $7 times.
Yeah.
We now know as the fireman.
Yeah.
And you said that the curtains looked a bit like wooden texture.
Yeah, it looked very wooden to me,
right.
yes.
And that got my brain percolating. Of course, I couldn't spoil a whole lot because we just started the return, but I can say now that's kind of become my headcanon. That's one of the things you've said over the course of this podcast that's really started to get to my brain.
Where the wooden textures mean that they could potentially be in the log of Margaret
They could be
Lannerman.
either in a tree, like a sycamore tree, in the woods of Ghostwood or etc., or they could be literally in the log, whether it's ponderosa pine or some other wood, depending on your source material, potentially in Margaret Lannerman's log. And that's really resonated because I don't know if I've heard that from anywhere else. That's not to say it hasn't been said somewhere else. I'm woefully behind on my Twin Peaks podcasts. I don't know what everyone else has said.
You've clearly missed out on The Fireman Exists in the Margaret Lannerman's Log, the podcast.
Yeah, that's actually what it's called. Yeah, The Fireman in the Log. I don't know how I missed that one. But I don't know if it's a dominant theory or not. But I don't hear a lot of people refer to the black and white areas with the firemen as being related to wood or the log. I generally don't hear that as the descripting element that they bring up. So it's really been my headcanon though, because now that you pointed that out, how wooden the curtains look, how just kind of strangely textured a lot of the items, like even like the record player or the bell-shaped icon look. And then you go to the theater, that happens later on with obviously the screen going on and the golden orb and all that stuff. That also has a very wooden texture to a lot of the surfaces on the floor, on the curtains, etc. And so I fully believe into that theory. Well, for this special feature, we got to see those areas not in black and white.
Yes.
We got to see them fully in color as sets.
Now, I want to preface this before we go too far deep into this. Like, color that you see as opposed to black and white. Black and white is very much an art form, ever since its conception, especially on the illusion of making sure that everything that is seen is not too dark, that is bright enough, and sometimes even is the illusion of certain colors. Most recent example that also used black and white into a modern frame is something such as WandaVision. Everyone knows about like Vision's like red face, but in order to get the tone and hue that they needed, like you're working with a whole different scale whenever it comes to that colorization, they had to paint them blue instead of red. And if you saw a big old Smurf Oompa Loompa situation of Vision, that's nothing that's going to be canon there. No, it's just working with a new format. With that being said, with the verdant green curtains, I think that the texture that is being popped from it still does evoke those very wooden looks from my eyes.
So if we just looked at the material on its own, we both think it looks like wood. We both have to factor that into our headcanons. If we also wanted to extend to the behind-the-scenes footage, that reaffirmed. It doesn't look like a lot of that wooden texture, wooden look was added in like post-production or editing or whatever. It looks like David Lynch probably requested them to look like this, with that kind of look and texture, which we think looks very wooden. And David Lynch, would you believe it, is very particular about some of the materials that he uses and the way things look.
Especially whenever it comes to tones and colors. And seeing as he's worked on like 2 black and white features in the past with Eraserhead as
and
well
short
as
films.
and short
the grandmother,
films,
yeah.
To say that he has experience in this realm is, well, a little bit obvious.
I also think like of all the areas he'd want to get exactly right, I feel like this is an area that matters. I mean, this is pretty hugely important visual area. So if it's not meant to look like wood, it's an uncanny resemblance in my opinion, and I think the professors as well. So even though we're not always like, oh, the intentions, are important, we're not always big on the intentions of the author, I would still bet David Lynch meant it to look like wood.
I think he meant everything he could inside of this space. From what I understand from the way that he spoke of it, he spoke about it in such high platitudes that if he had more time, like he would go crazy in this place. Like he adored this spot.
And again, if it's not intended to be wood, I still think it looks like it, and that's still how I'm going to view things, I suppose. While I was watching this 5-ish hours of material, I was really looking to see if Mark Frost would be on the set. And I don't know if I saw or heard Mark Frost, and if I might have missed him. Maybe he was in the background during a part. I just wasn't looking at the screen because I was typing in my notes. I did a lot of multitasking during this. I could have missed him, but he was not an active agent for the majority of this, that's for sure. And whenever there were clips shown of like briefings or like meetings, the camera was on David Lynch. He was the one doing the talking. You really didn't hear other people's voices other than asking him questions or trying to work with him, for efficiency or something. I didn't hear Mark Frost or see Mark Frost at those meetings either.
Yeah, for the most part, like you maybe like heard two people inside the background. I think one of them was credited as a man named Sam, but elsewise it was just, it seemed like it was a very small room with maybe 1, 2, and at most 3 people in there, as they were privately going over the fact like things are going to be shot a certain way.
So I would kind of go in with the, maybe tacit assumption that if it involves the production of The Return, it's probably David Lynch, not Mark Frost. Just from what we can see and hear and observe in this particular documentary. Now, granted, when we go through the next one, which is like 8 hours of a kind of similar content, I'm going to be looking for Mark Frost again. And I'm going to see if he shows up and what he does. But for this one, yeah, it was not a lot of his role. In fact, I was curious, maybe in the 8-hour one, we'll see the part where Mark Frost was an actor, because he played Cyril Pons, who was in the forest during the Stephen and Becky part, and he went and, told, I think it was Harry Dean Stanton's character, right, about what was going on. Mark Frost had to be on the set to be his own actor, unless they CG'd Mark Frost in. So we'll have to see him eventually if they cover everything.
I'm just thinking in the same like respects where like it's too obvious, like CG Mark Hamill from that Johnny Bravo episode. He was replaced with CG Mark Hamill. I'm just imagining that roaming around the studio in the most
I do not know
fashion.
that, but you'll have to show me that later. I am curious about the Johnny Bravo Mark Hamill Uncanny Valley. If it is uncanny. Sounds uncanny. A big appeal of this special feature for me was David Lynch's mindset, kind of getting a sense of what he's like as a director and the way he thinks and acts. Whether it's related to the production at set or just in general, like I always find Lynch's mind really interesting. Is that something also you were looking for or not so much?
I think that I was just going to run into plenty of David Lynch and the inner workings of David Lynch like throughout. It was an expectation more than anything. And from what I came to understand and my impressions from David Lynch throughout this is he seems like a type of guy that is very passionate with his art. I think I'm very more solidified that he seems like in that painter-esque sort of mentality. He falls into it like a canvas. He wishes to take more time onto the strokes, but that might not always be possible. But he is very passionate with his work. I think that one of the most notable things I got from like the David Lynch passion and like the inner workings of him was more so how he behaves with different people. Like I think his personality pops in a more sort of like chill on your level person when he's like dealing with the other actors. I think that he becomes more like mentally focused when he's with the crew and staff, and he becomes very humble whenever he feels like there's nothing he's left to do. Like he's someone that when he is defeated, he just like comes down with it, and there is a genuine like sadness with him.
Sure. And I do want to explore that for sure. I think before that, though, I would like to talk maybe about some of the moments where it was more Lynch kind of musing almost to himself, or replies where I think it maybe reveals more about Lynch very specifically rather than with a cast or crew. So there were 3 that I jotted down, and you're free to add any more that kind of fit this that you also thought were interesting.
By all means.
But one was that he's in the cell at one point. I know it was during the shooting, and maybe it was for the Bill Hastings scene. I think it was the Bill Hastings.
Him and Shaggy were talking about how the cell felt.
Right. And David Lynch has talked about how he'd like a cell like this. He talks about how it's airy, he has his own toilet and bed and all the things he needs. And just this kind of curious mentality that he would be comfortable living in this cell as long as he had his basic things he needed to use utilities. He got a sense of privacy. It's got some free-flowing air, and we're good to go. And it reminds me of some of the things I remember seeing in the art life, but not that he lives in a cell, but that he lives kind of like a hermit sometimes. Like, he does seem to have his own little secluded area with sort of a workshop, and he's generally pretty private and more used to solitude. I don't think he lives with anyone else at this moment. I don't think he lives near a lot of people. And especially during COVID times and since, I think that he has been very reclusive.
Yeah.
So hearing him talk about how he'd be comfortable just living in a cell, I think is pretty revealing potentially of his mindset toward life and toward what's necessary, that he could take something as really bare bones and mundane looking as a cell and be like, yeah, this could be home, and be fine with that, really. Yeah. There's also this part that I found personally interesting where he's talking with someone off camera, so I'm not sure who it is, and they're talking about Martin Luther King Jr. And it's one of those moments where it's put in the documentary, but there's not a lot of context for it. It's just this little conversational bit that was included in there. And Lynch is talking about how there was this story he had heard or read where there's this person who had been talking to Martin Luther King Jr. while kind of the speech was going on. And I don't know if it's the March on Washington or a different speech. And this person who was with King was trying to encourage him, trying to say, like, really tell them how it is, tell them like it is, and trying to like get him to be more vocal and more to his heart, to be true to himself. And Lynch was talking about how, King wasn't the main speaker. It was like the third or fourth speaker there. And that his messages of nonviolence were not necessarily as appealing as what Lynch called some of the more, maybe radical elements that wanted to have a more any methods are acceptable sort of revolution that may incorporate more aggression or more violence as a means of fighting against oppressors. And he was talking about King, and Lynch says that, I think it's with the person off camera, that some of these people who are very spiritual, that they get clued in to something. And that's where it sort of ends at that moment. And I found this interesting for a couple reasons. One is I'm not used to hearing Lynch talk about historical public figures very much.
Yeah.
I don't know what Lynch thinks of a lot of things. He generally keeps a lot of his politics and personal philosophies to himself outside of art. He talks a lot about art, obviously. So hearing him talk about King this way was pretty interesting. King is someone that I find personally very aspirational. I have a lot of respect for Martin Luther King Jr. Remember in high school, I read this like very big tome of like all the collected writings of King. It's called like A Testament of Hope. Very much into his ideology at that time. And still generally, I do appreciate a lot of his writing and beliefs. And to hear Lynch talk about that was really just personally interesting. But then also this idea of someone who is very spiritual getting clued in. Because I don't consider, and I don't think Lynch considers himself to be Christian. Lynch has spiritual inclinations. He's very big into transcendental meditation. Yeah. And I think he's a spiritual person. But I don't know if he would be a lot of people's idea of Christian the way that like Martin Luther King Jr. was literally a Christian like pastor, like for a Baptist church. So hearing Lynch talk about King that way is interesting because I imagine he would say very similar things about the Dalai Lama. It's just a general, I don't know if reverence is the word, but it seems like a stance that spirituality is a way to get clued in, not just to art, which I think is the way it affects his life, but also to other truths that might be able to persuade people. Or maybe I guess you could say, oratory skills are an art and writing is an art. So maybe that also is included. But Lynch's admiration and focus on spiritual inclinations, I thought was a big takeaway from that moment.
I believe that you are on the money there. I do think that is very fitting for it.
And then the last thing was this conversation he had with the employee from Dirtfish. I'm not sure if it was like a manager or an owner. He seemed to be someone maybe with a bit more authority from my gleaning of it. Yeah. And if you don't know, Dirtfish is the company that now owns the building that previously was the Twin Peaks Sheriff Department.
Which, if you see a shot inside of this background feature, like as you're walking through, like the front desk area looks exactly the same, and just the lobby, it's just there. It's covered in like coat racks.
It's very fun. It's very fun.
If you wanted a Dirtfish coat, it's 3 steps away from Lucy.
And the manager or owner is talking with David Lynch, making some small talk and asking, Lynch where he's from. And, Lynch says he's from Los Angeles, California. And the Dirtfish employee's like, wow, you must have seen a lot of changes there over these years. Because David Lynch has obviously been there for quite a long time. And that's a pretty, I think, understandable response to give that, a lot has changed over the years probably.
Yeah, it's a lively city.
But Lynch responds kind of after a brief pause that a lot of it's the same. And that's it. And then he moves on. And I think it's interesting. I really don't know what to really make of it, so maybe you can help me, Professor. But I think it's interesting that when presented with an opportunity to talk about how much things have changed in the city he lives in, he instead goes to reassert how much things have stayed the same. What do you make of that for his mindset?
I think it's the scope. I think that as far as his scope is concerned, he sees that perhaps the lifestyle hasn't changed too terribly much. Perhaps it's the people around him haven't changed too terribly much. I don't know how much he is into the physicality of things. I know that he admires, or at the very least in the past has admired, like mechanical and industrial physicality, despite the dissonance that he recognizes it gives and the negative connotations it has. So if, like, industrially, like, it might have, like, certain expanses here and there, but elsewise, like, the environments and the people that he gets to know, and perhaps he's feeling more and more disillusioned, and he can put that disillusionment in multiple timelines, as you said, with the industry before. It could just be, he views things in the scope that's only personally to him. I mean,
and,
like,
and if we
everyone
look at
does,
him
but
being more reclusive, especially in recent years, he may not be seeing all of the changes as much.
He might very well not be into seeking out some of the things that have changed. Maybe there's more goat yoga around, like...
Goat yoga?
Yeah, goat yoga. It's yoga, but you have a goat with you.
What are you talking about?
It's goat yoga. It's a yoga with a goat.
I mean, I get it, but what's it to do with David Lynch?
It's the matter of things can physically change, activities can change, and popularities and trends can change, and there's all sorts of, like, things that can come in waves, if you will, inside the area. So I don't think...
Is goat yoga big in Los Angeles?
I know that there was a bunch of people who started talking about it in one instance in my life, and I looked into it, and I was this close from going to it myself. But unfortunately, I was unable to.
For the record, the listener cannot know how close he was because he made a hand gesture. I'm going to let you, the listener, imagine how close was he?
How close was I to goat yoga?
I want you to send your number of closeness to our email, snakeeyedreams@gmail.com, or tweet at us at snakeeyedreams1. That's the numeral 1, was it 1? Was that the number?
1 unit.
Or was
whatever
it,
unit
was it
you
many
think.
more
Is it
units?
goat? Is goat the unit?
Goat is not a number. Let's not be silly.
If I was 5 goats away from goat yoga,
we measure things in big eds here, okay? So how many big eds away was he from doing this?
I want the correct, like, translation from big eds to goat, like, ratio.
So things that David Lynch said on the set that may reveal maybe some of his intentions creatively. I know that you and I are, death of the author. We're all about the idea that, authorial intent is in everything. But I still find it interesting when it pops up. I still find it fun to talk about and discuss and try to glean the mind of this man and potentially what he thinks he's doing. Because we're not sure what he's doing sometimes.
What are we doing at any moment of
Yeah. So David Lynch, he's talking to Cheryl Lee, and he mentions, it was one of the earlier shots, he mentions Jacques and Leo. And obviously, Jacques and Leo are not in Twin Peaks: The Return.
They are.
The actor who plays Jacques plays a new Renault.
But they're in the flashback.
Are they?
I'm pretty sure they're in the flashback.
Well, then in the flashback.
They are in there.
Well, my point was that when he mentioned Leo, that does indicate that David Lynch, I know this may be a low bar for some, he remembers who Leo Johnson is.
As opposed to the Toad.
And I bring that up because sometimes there are things that in The Return do not show up. We do not get answers or situations aren't addressed. Leo Johnson is one of those cases where we left Leo Johnson at the end of season 2 biting onto a string attached to a cage of tarantulas or some kind of spider.
Some people say he's still there.
Some people say he's still there.
After 15 years, he's holding on to that tarantula.
I think most people, maybe I'm speaking too broadly here, I think most people assume that Leo Johnson does die. I'm assuming, right? It's not a great situation. The last cut we get of him is comically edited in with other scenes where it just rapidly cuts to him straining and then cuts out of it. So it doesn't seem like he's doing very well.
Best case scenario, he was able to gently put down the spider cage. And
I don't think with his mental state that was
walk
going
into
to
the
happen.
woods. He became Bigfoot.
So most likely, yeah, Leo Johnson probably died at the end of season 2. But actually, that's the real twist, is that nobody mentions it. But if you look closely at some of the outdoor wood scenes in Washington, you'll notice a Bigfoot occasionally. Like Jerry Horn's running, from what he thinks is maybe not his foot. And if you look in the background for just a few frames behind a tree,
you realize
it's a splotch of brown.
It's a splotch of brown. The straight jacket has gotten dirty all over this time, and the hair has grown a little bit longer on his hair. It's been a wild journey. You thought Jerry's journey was wild. Wait till you hear about Leo's.
Man. But this is notable that Lynch, isn't forgetting that Leo Johnson doesn't exist. It's not like he didn't know what happened at the end of season 2. He's just choosing not to talk about it. He's choosing not to address Leo Johnson's fate.
I think I prefer that.
Just for the ambiguity?
I think the ambiguity works for Leo Johnson. I think that when a good portion of people can say that Leo Johnson likely died,
right. That's my guess. I mean,
it's one of those points where like you still can't fully put indefinitely on it, and it's just still a fun thought to just leave at he's probably dead.
Right?
Right.
I don't know. Maybe I'm not correct. Maybe if you would have polled viewers at the season finale, maybe they would have said he's still alive. But from what you have gained from the return, how many things and holes they filled in between this point and the return, for what I would foresee is if a Leo Johnson thing came up, he would just appear with us not knowing what happened with the spider, and he's just living in Twin Peaks. That feels less satisfying than what happened to Leo Johnson. Yeah. He's probably dead. As the script is right now, there's not a lot of places you could just casually bring it up without it feeling incredibly out of left field.
And Leo Johnson walks out instead of Mark Frost and says, "Hey, you!"
I don't think there's a reason why adults, Bobby or Shelley are going to bring up Leo with their daughter at a diner. I don't see it likely to happen.
Leo Johnson becomes a cop.
I just know the way you do it, right, is that Becky's having these troubles with Steven, and Bobby and Shelley are talking at the diner, and then Bobby shakes his head and he says, Shelley, this reminds me a lot of the situation you were in 25 years ago when you were married to Leo Johnson, the truck driver, who famously went into the woods one day and had an incident with the tarantulas. And then Shelley nods sadly. It's like, yeah, he was a bad man, but I wish he hadn't been killed by those tarantulas 25 years ago. And then they just look at the camera, and then Becky looks at the camera, and then the thing happens outside with the zombie vomiting and all that stuff.
Can we both agree that the best case outcome, if we were to have Leo Johnson back, is that if all the characters saw this one character, I'm going to give the name right here. Okay. All the characters saw this one character and just sees this character, and they don't recognize him as Leo Johnson. No, the actor for Leo Johnson dresses up as Norma at the Double R, and everyone just acknowledges
such a better
Leo
costume than Tojimura.
Norma.
Such a better costume than Tojimura.
But everything screams Leo.
That'd be really good.
The kiss at the end would have been amazing.
It would have been amazing. I've been waiting so long for this to happen. Man, that's great. We also get a little bit of clarity potentially on what Lynch thinks is going on with Dougie Jones, because one of the things that is agonizing for us and for a lot of viewers as we're watching is, how are people feeling about Dougie Jones? Do they realize this man needs help? Are they perceiving the gravity of how bad this is? Because most people, as the script is written, do not seem to acknowledge vocally or in their actions how bad this is, with a few rare exceptions. People generally just think, oh, man, Dougie, he seems like he's a little off today.
Just a little.
But then not really, getting him help.
Yeah.
But David Lynch, when he's talking to the actor who plays Bushnell Mullins, he mentions Dougie Jones isn't doing well psychologically and says he's acting like a zombie, which I think is a pretty interesting and loaded word choice. Because we do have, I just alluded to it, you do have that kid who's acting like they're borderline a zombie in the car with Bobby, and this idea of a zombie isn't also too far from the woodsman wandering like living dead through the black and white area of the 50s.
Yeah.
So there already is this idea of slowly walking the living dead, someone who's dead yet alive, like Laura Palmer. Mm-hmm. If I want to read into the term zombie, there's actually a few candidates that might fit zombie in Twin Peaks: The Return. Dougie being called a zombie is interesting. I don't know how much to read into that, though, because one, it's not in the actual show. It's, a remark David Lynch makes to an actor, but it's still that idea that he's telling the actor for Bushnell Mullins to treat him kind of like a zombie. But then the way the script is written, there really aren't a lot of remarks about it. So the takeaway I get from this, and I'm curious on your takeaway, I think that Lynch may have given to actors the idea that this is really bad, Dougie's really acting weird, and that's how you should react to him. But the script doesn't have lines making that very direct. So you end up with this interesting in-between state where facial reactions and emotive reactions are confused about Dougie, but the lines aren't as dramatic. The script doesn't have them actually get help, but they're going to react like it's that level of bad.
Maybe it's a case where I'm looking more into the metaphor rather than like a more literal sense, but whenever I think of like zombie, I'm thinking someone
The Cranberries song.
I didn't know that was a band, but in any case,
it's a good song from the 90s.
I can only imagine. This person is just showing a little bit of, they're almost themselves, but not quite. There are features and things that resemble the person, but it's not all quite there as a metaphor. Oftentimes, like, maybe it could be accused towards tiredness or stress or anything like that someone can do. People have compared other people to zombies in that sort of like metaphorical sphere. So that's kind of like my takeaway from it, rather than the literal sense of a zombie. If someone's like acting like a zombie at work, I'm not going to call the police and be like, hey, excuse me, I think they need help. No, I think they need coffee. And guess what? They keep giving them coffee.
They keep giving them coffee. How metaphorical do you take it when David Lynch calls Kyle MacLachlan a magician?
I would say on like a balance board?
Mm-hmm. Measure it in big heads, please.
65 big heads as opposed to 35 big heads on the balance board.
Gotcha. That's
so a little bit imbalanced, but the 35 big heads are fighting. They're holding their own.
I'm inclined to believe, right, that David Lynch just meant that Kyle MacLachlan works magic. That he's a great actor. He does great work. I think that's all he meant. The problem is, when you're watching this special feature as a big Twin Peaks fan, and someone mentions the word magician, you're like, oh, is he the one that chants out between two worlds? Like
Kyle MacLachlan specifically.
Kyle MacLachlan specifically, or Dale Cooper, right? Or some variation on that character. It's like immediately when I hear the word magician, I'm like zooming in because it's like, that's a Twin Peaks word. And if there was a Twin Peaks like crossword book, that would be one of the words.
And as you zoom in, also Mike off to the side is also being zoomed in on and starts doing the chant. It was a very weird instance, but no, like it's one of those cases where I think it's just a word that David Lynch associates with multiple things.
But if you want to read into it, there's some fodder for you.
Enjoy. Eat happily.
Also fodder potentially for David Lynch isms in general when he's talking about the voice of the character I'm going to call Nido, and then immediately shortly after this moment call into question whether that's the name. Nido, they're talking about the voice of this character, and David Lynch says that you start to talk mechanical. David Lynch says, quote, "You start to talk mechanical." End quote. So
it sounds like you're winding up your David Lynch impression. You're starting to sound mechanical, Kalil.
Yeah. So this idea of mechanical, I would not have said that if you were to ask me, how would you describe Nido's vocal mannerisms in The Return? I might have said like there's some clicking, there's some chattering. I would almost say more like animal noise than mechanical noise.
Clicking and chattering, though, are like synonymous in this onomatopoeia realm of like mechanical, though.
But they also could be birds.
They could also be birds. They could be mechanical birds.
So what
have you seen The Mighty Cuckoo?
From your vantage point, I'm watching someone play Sly Cooper right now, okay? from your vantage point, do you view Nido's voice and mannerisms as more mechanical or more animal biological or something else? Dying?
That's dying.
See, I don't hear those. I agree with you. That's actually a very good replication. I don't hear mechanical out of that.
I could see someone like potentially saying it's like a squeaky wheel, like trying to like twist and turn around. Some could say like if they are trying to be a marionette that is like trying to get something out but can't. Mm-hmm. Those are a few different arguments.
Needs more scorched engine oil.
Pour it down the throat and see what comes out. No, I don't. I think that there's laws. There's union laws.
I don't know. That. Do human rights extend to supernatural entities?
Yes.
Okay.
If they're on the stage, yes.
Okay, fine. So there's some instances where David Lynch says the name of a character, and I'm kind of questioning, should I call them that too? So I've been saying this entire time, Nido, because it's spelled in the credits Naido. At no point is the name said.
Nido.
And I'm thinking, okay, well, the casting, I believe it was a Japanese performer or Japanese American, I'm pretty sure. And I'm reading the word in the way I would imagine Japanese pronunciation would be. Nido. He says Nado. And I'm looking at that and I'm like, is David Lynch saying it's actually Nado? or does he not know how to say the name of the character? Now, let me give one more before we can give our verdict. The second one, very similar, is there's a character named Senorita, and I've been saying Dido. It's D-I-D-O. And I'm saying Dido, one, because of the, famous historical, the Dido. And then also I'm thinking of the music artist from the late 90s, early 2000s, Dido. Great song, White Flag. But I'm looking at this and I'm like, Senorita Dido. Because it's never said aloud, it's only in the credits. He says Senorita Dido.
I think that since Senorita Dido, is that the name of the character or the person?
Character. And one, I just want to offer one defense. Maybe this is where you're going with it. Maybe I've been thinking it's Dido because of the other versions I've heard of this name, but it's actually meant to take on a Spanish pronunciation, hence the Senorita. And, Spanish pronunciation, maybe D-I-D-O is closer to Dido.
It's one of those cases where I don't know where the ong starts and where the ang begins. It's one of those cases where one could be the more traditional sort of statement and the sounding, and then the other one could be the one that's just being spoken and adapted into. It's hard to say.
And to clarify the ong ang thing, you're referring to Avatar: The Last Airbender, that in the TV series it's pronounced ang. But in the M. Night Shyamalan film, it's pronounced ong, and the ong pronunciation is potentially more culturally accurate to some of the regions that's being depicted or drawn from inspiration-wise.
Yes.
But that's not how it's said in the show.
Yes.
Okay. Just double-checking, making sure we're all on the same page.
By all means.
So my kind of takeaway is that, yes, you may be right. You may be right.
I feel very
right. To
right.
quote Billy Joel, you may be right. You may be crazy.
I think the Nido Nado.
Oh, but it might just be a lunatic I'm looking for.
Yeah, the lunatic's name is David Lynch. We've been over this.
My other question is that if Mark Frost and David Lynch wrote the script together, and some people say that Mark Frost is more the lore and mythology guy, and if we look at the secret history, that seems to be an area that Mark Frost is interested in, is it possible that Mark Frost came up with the names and David Lynch didn't, and then when David Lynch says them, he says them differently than Mark Frost would?
Or even David Lynch spells a certain thing and he thinks that it's a certain name, that he'll say the certain name without any sort of thought otherwise, because there's never been evidence of David Lynch saying something and being very confident in saying it.
So there's a possibility it is pronounced Nado and then Dido. And if that's your pronunciation, then David Lynch is also in agreement with you. I still think it's Nido and Dido. Or maybe it's even worse. It's Nido and Dido, or Nido and Dido, and it's actually, they're not the same, and it's a bit of both. And I don't know. What's your pronunciation preference at this point?
Nido is one I'm more confident with, just because it seems to be phonetically more what I'm used to. I could be incorrect. I open up myself up to being incorrect. But phonetically, it sounds just the better option. Dido and Dido, far less experienced with the phonetics there. So at this point, it's one of those I'm lost in the fog and I don't know what to do, so I'd rather ask an expert. And I don't got one in my pocket.
Perhaps the expert you're looking for is the intern at the Lucky 7 Insurance Company, who you may know from the credits, from the Twin Peaks Wiki, from IMDb, from pretty much any source, as a character called Phil Bisbee.
Phil Bisbee.
It's also what is in the script, according to the actor, during the shooting. But, inexplicably, David Lynch calls him Blix. And when the actor is, responding to this, he's like, yeah, but in the script, and then David Lynch it's Blix. So then he goes by Blix. But from what I'm aware of, unless I'm missing something, in no piece of media is it ever that his name is Blix. I think David Lynch called him that, and that's what he referred him to, and I don't think that's his name. I don't think that's actually his name in the script or any material officially.
David Lynch knows better than all of us in this. It has to be Blix.
Because I don't know if they say his name. Maybe they say Phil Bisbee's name.
They don't really say his name from what I recall.
I think so. If they do, it's very briefly.
I don't think it matters. It's one of those cases...
He's the main character. What do you mean?
It's one of those cases
He's
where...
the main character Twin Peaks The Return.
It is one of the easiest points to throw into the towel because, let's say, this is the name of the character. Since it's not something that's formally brought up or, this character isn't, major in any way or fashion, it doesn't mean that I don't like the performance the intern has given. It's just more so, if I took the intern out, it just means Dougie's stuck in the elevator for 5 extra minutes. At the end of the day, I don't care.
I just need to know what to talk. If we talk about him in our podcast, I want to know what to say his name is.
Then the intern.
Even though we've always said the intern.
We have always said the intern.
Well, I thought it was worth bringing up.
Blixby, you don't matter, and I'm sorry about that. The actor, you did wonderful.
There's going to be at least
you are
one
doing a
listener
great
to
job.
this podcast who is going to be very interested in the fact that we had this conversation and very appreciative about it, okay?
Listener, fight me.
Listener, hello. How are you doing? So,
speaking of people that I think are probably unpaid and shouldn't be unpaid, children.
Shouldn't be unpaid?
I mean, I think they should get a paycheck. I just don't know how
Child
much
labor?
There's child labor here. When a child is acting on set, that is a form of labor.
Doesn't the parents get the money?
I don't know.
I never...
Have you had a child?
I've never been
to
a child...
put a contract?
I've also never been a child actor myself.
Then unfortunately, you have nowhere to speak on this
I
matter.
would assume they would have to pay the parent.
You'd
But
have
like
to-
taxes. You're not going to have the kid do the taxes.
It's taxi. They have to learn sometime.
Yes.
Right out of the womb. Right out of the womb, just get them in that desk. You got a 1099, kid.
That's the
It's the real world now.
it feels like a cut scene from like Terry Gilliam's Brazil. You know, the scene where the doctor takes the baby. It's a boy. All right, tax time. Like, just move to the next room. Oh, man.
So beyond taxing the babies, the different interactions that we've seen with David Lynch and the actors, like there's certain levels I go through. What was very intriguing to me, I would say, is David Lynch interacting with children. And there's different degrees that he does. We see externally from like working with a child actor is that they had a morning shoot that they were going to be shooting outside, and they were looking at the cars and what they could do and handle with them. And this was the scene where the kid would like inspect the bomb underneath the car, and you expect the kid to blow up.
Right. But David Lynch would never kill a kid in The Return.
In fact, David Lynch wouldn't try to kill the kid outside The Return either.
I hope not.
And he said that like like the kid would freeze to death outside. Like it is way too cold around this time. Like we're gonna just push the shoot until it gets a little bit warmer and so on. So there's this nice little consideration that he has. Like it doesn't go over his head when he's like in the zone. Like
right.
Making sure the actors are well is notable with him. And the way that he sort of like tries to work things out with the kid and go step by step with them. If I was that kid and I was given all these instructions while David Lynch is going through them, I would be lost at the first 5 words. This kid is a prodigy.
He goes through so many steps and instructions that like it's just the sheer breadth of them. None of them are individually that hard, but you've given me like 8 too many things.
I couldn't do that as an adult right now.
Right. But I do think it's worth mentioning that the way he talks, he doesn't talk down to kids. He doesn't really change or alter his voice or mannerisms much. He talks to them pretty similarly to how he talks to other people.
He just like lets people sort of go in, and he tries to, I think, assess things on their level in the moment. I think a good example, like with this kid specifically going through instruction after instruction, he's letting him like lean into it directly. He starts with that with other child actors when there's like a group of children together, and he's like trying to get this kid to yell. And
not a happy yell.
The best part is like when he's asking him to yell, it goes to like 6 times, like 5 or 6 times where he's like just trying to get him to yell and it does not work. But he has got so much patience with this. It's like he's trying to get him and he gets it to the point of yelling. So that's a checkpoint reach. But the thing is that the kid is sounding happy. It's like, ah! It's like, not happy. All right, let's go yell. Ah! Not happy. Let's go with another yell. Ah! And he keeps going like that for a bit until like he like tries to like maneuver around. It's like you're at a rock concert. Ah! It's like, yeah, that's the one.
And it's funny, too, because that scene is such a small scene.
It's such a small scene.
You could forget about it even existing.
But the thing is that, like, I don't sense, at the very least, David Lynch is getting impatient. I get a sense that he's trying to work with it. And I think he's trying to work with the actor and just, like, go with the mood and the tone and just sort of, like, keep falling into it. And I can only imagine the other actor sitting down waiting for the right tone to come through.
Right.
As it's, ah! No, too happy. Ah! Too happy. Ah! Just you don't have to be the fly on the wall. You just have to be the other actor in the room.
Right,
it's like,
right.
I'm staring just so the listener is knowing. I realize this is an audio podcast.
Have you figured it out after 3 years? Yeah, also this kind of just segues into how often David Lynch is directing actors to go for very big emotions, not necessarily subtle emotions. And this tracks with everything we've ever heard about David Lynch. Of course, there's that famous story from seasons 1 and 2 where Benjamin Horne, Richard Bamer being the actor there, was being continuously pressed to take bigger and bigger bites out of that sandwich and out of that bread. And we know that Lynch often goes for very exaggerated, big sort of deliveries, even if they might come across as awkward or stilted by film standards.
Yes.
And so we see that a lot in the behind the scenes, that he is really pushing. Like when he describes something's emotion, he'll say, and you see this, and it's absolutely devastating. It's the worst thing you've ever seen before. Like he goes always for like very hyped up wording. It's like that Ike the Spike moment when he's like, this is such an utter sadness. This is the worst thing. Like he just goes into it, right? No matter what the output is, David Lynch always seems to put the input at max level, which I think is curious. And I'm imagining is a quirk of his directing style that may not be unanimous with other big name directors.
Yeah.
And speaking of big emotions, sometimes David Lynch himself expresses big emotions. During the viewing, what did you think of the times where David Lynch got angry about something?
It comes off of very, well, obviously, anger is very personal, but it comes especially personal in the respects that David Lynch wants to make sure things are going in a certain path, and when it isn't, like he's not going to try to hide it. When it's something that like the crew, cast, and so on are informing him that hey, like this couldn't happen or they had to arrange this, he will like vocalize it, being like, if only we had more time. Is like you just needed to be this way or that way.
Yeah, that's way nicer than he puts it. He will throw in some F-bombs as he's going through it. He
will say fucking A. Like I love people who say fucking A because they say the fuck word, but ass is just a little bit too far. Just fucking A. But yeah, anyway, he gets very passionate about those, but he will wind down and recognize the reality of the things, be A-okay with it. I think it's only like when something is suggested against his course of action that is not inevitable, like when he knows that he has that time to work on something.
Wait. Does the A actually mean that?
Fuck yeah, fucking A means ass.
What does that mean?
It's ass.
But like, why would you?
Why would you censor it?
No. Nobody says the full words of both together, though.
Fucking ass.
What does that mean in the context of disappointment that I couldn't get the thing I wanted?
I don't know why
Are you
it is
sure
the way
that's what
that
the A
it
stands
is.
for?
What does the A stand for then, Kalil?
I am going to go to Google.
Alphabet?
I'm going to Google.
Fucking alligators?
Please don't do that. All right. Okay. I'm just going to type in, what does the A stand for?
In fucking A.
I mean, yeah, I specified. I'm going to Reddit, r/no stupid questions. Okay, in Canada, they do the A. Okay, sure, that helps. It's the top comment. Very helpful.
Okay,
thank you.
no. You have to be clear on this. On like, are you saying
EH.
fucking A?
Yeah. Okay, and the second answer does say yours. Your answer.
Yeah.
Third one.
Fucking S.
Third one says, I always thought it was affirmative.
This is fucking S.
Affirmative.
This is fucking affirmative.
Well, yeah, it's like you're affirming it. What? Someone says grade A. So it doesn't matter if it's positive, it's the highest caliber of it.
The highest caliber of A's presented. What do you think David Lynch means? I think he thinks fucking Canada.
Someone said awesome, which I don't think applies to all emotions of what you could be saying there. Someone said adrenaline? That doesn't make any sense. Okay, all right.
Fucking adrenaline!
Okay, I don't know what it means. I give up.
What a wild rabbit hole.
What a wild Twin Peaks rabbits.
But whatever the fucking A's or A-naughts will be, it was this one point where like someone tried to like slow him down in the respects, and they were speaking in a professional tone, and they likely had experience onto it. It's like, if we want, we can like skip around like this point so we can focus on other shots. And the thing is that David Lynch knew he had the time, so that's when like something snapped with him, in which he's like was just tired of hearing people on this respects of like how they have to like keep things moving or keep things snapping. He wants to take his time on this. You don't need to rush these scenes. Who cares how fucking long it is? And in his words,
yeah, he says, "Who cares how long a scene is?"
We do, but I know that
Well, it's such an interesting question because if you read into it. There are people who care how long a scene is. One would be anyone who has to deal with how this is all going to get put together at the end of the day, because you have to cut this into a specific amount of time per episode. So, like, yeah, it actually does matter from that standpoint. But then also for the audience, like, yeah, I mean, you have viewers. So I think that it's interesting. If you want to read into it, you can read into the element that for David Lynch's idea of being the artist, it doesn't matter how long the scene is. That's not a constraint. If the scene needs to be longer for the emotion or for the moment, you go as long as it needs to go. It doesn't matter.
He feels that he needs to take his time with his pieces, and through his comments, it comes up again and again and again with that like desire to have more time. Which
I would argue that resulted in scenes that felt dragged out in the return in ways that I, as a viewer personally, did not enjoy as much. I would point to the scene where it's the lady leaving Gordon Cole's apartment or hotel or whatever it was.
No, I can completely understand. But do you know something that David Lynch didn't enjoy personally?
What?
David Lynch didn't enjoy Plaster in Paris.
Plaster of Paris.
Plaster of Paris. This Plaster of Paris and a connection between them did not enjoy it whatsoever. It was one of those cases in juxtaposition of it. One that he's blowing up like directly at a person and just like conceptually at the idea of like rushing. They come in and they say that like Plaster of Paris, they only had that, and David Lynch is then freaking out. And there is a point where he is very frustrated, but from what I can tell in the way that he sort of like moves his head away from the situation, that he is vocalizing externally. He realizes that it's something that can't be changed. He's asking then later to mix it up, but he's still very vocal that he is very upset onto this, but it sounds like he's more so on the circumstance than the person at the time.
Yeah.
In which it seemed like from our speculation before that it might be the person he might be upset with.
I think the intention is that he is just mad that he couldn't get what he needed. Because the guy who showed up just said this is all they had. Like, they grabbed the best thing they could that was available. So I don't think David Lynch is blaming the person. It doesn't seem like it's a targeted thing. But also, if I was the person who had to say, you know, tell him the bad news, I would feel bad. I would feel like he just yelled at me, even though I don't think that was the intent.
It doesn't seem like anyone wants to be the one to give David Lynch the bad news.
Which I would say that anyone we watch in this feature, I think they all talk professionally to David Lynch. I think everyone who tries to tell him no or has to tell him about a constraint or a concern, everyone does approach him, I think, very professionally and respectfully. It's just that depending on what the information is, I would find it difficult to work with him if I had to tell him no on things. And then on the flip side, when he does get what he wants, he can be very appreciative. There's an instance with, also with kind of materials, if you want to think of it that way, with special effects work, that someone was working on the artificial head of the Renzo character who gets punched by Mr. C after the arm wrestling match and is bleeding profusely out of the head. And he's talking to the guy who made that head and is really just complimenting him. He puts his hand on his shoulder. He says he's just very happy about it. It's great work. It's phenomenal. He's like smiling. And if I was that guy who made the prop, I would feel like, oh my God, you're adopting me into your family. I love you. You're so special to me. Thank you, Senpai.
I'm glad.
I'd be so happy.
I'm glad that you've been invited to the Christmas party.
I would feel so like appreciated in a way that I don't know if a lot of directors show that much, you know, appreciation. Maybe they do, but this is something that I would feel very honored by.
From what I understand, from the statements from like everyone inside the David Lynch's productions up till now, is that it is a different atmosphere. So if it is the case in this more personal aspect, it may very well be the case in which it's not to say no director gives praises,
right?
But it seems that David Lynch very much is someone that I think gives off an energy that when the praise is given,
it feels earnest, it feels personable.
Yes.
And he's also, you know, when something goes wrong, he will apologize, and he seems sincere at that too. When they have to shoot out a sequence, he's like, you know, I know, I'm sorry. This is actually one of the scenes later for your character. You know, I apologize for that. And it feels very true, which is interesting because the people he's telling this to, I think it's the Mitchum brothers, and these are seasoned actors who've been around for decades. I'm sure they've had to do a lot of things out of scene and out of order.
He even says outright himself that, like, you probably have experience with this. Like, he already knows going in it's going to be the case, but it doesn't stop the emotion.
Right, because he feels as an actor, you know, you want to build off of previous scenes and everything. So I think that that's so interesting because he's also known for someone who doesn't give everyone the full context, he doesn't tell everyone the full truth, but that doesn't mean he isn't aware the fact that actors need to build off of something and need some sort of material. So working out of scene can be more challenging than working in order in certain respects. And he recognizes that. Going back to sort of the issues of people telling him no. The one that really struck me the most, I guess I would say, is when they're talking about the time limits and they're talking about scheduling, where there's this feeling that, someone off camera is telling him that, right now we're trying to shoot things as efficiently as possible. If we need to extend it, we can. That just means we'll have to pay, Benjamin Horne's actor an extra day. But we can do that. But it's David Lynch's kind of just this continuous element that we need to not worry about time. He says it's horrible. It's sick. Because this doesn't give him enough time, in his own words, to experiment, and it doesn't give him enough time to dream. He says they need to spend more time on the sets to dream. He says if he could have had his way, he would have wanted to spend a whole week at the Fireman's. I can't remember if it's a whole week or an extra week. I can't remember the way he worded it. But he wanted to spend more time at the Fireman's and really dream up more worlds. And I thought that was so interesting because... for a few reasons. One, it's that from a practical standpoint, the person who's off camera talking to him very respectfully, I think they're just doing their job. If their whole thing is they're trying to make sure that for budget reasons, they're only paying actors for the amount they really need to, they're not overspending on certain things, and that they're getting things done on a schedule that allows them to be, more productive, that makes sense.
And these aren't free use spaces. You probably also have to rent the entire lot.
And we're dealing with many locations, many sets.
Yeah.
There's legitimate reasons to make sure this gets done on time and gets done appropriately that would need to be worked through. But also the fact that David Lynch just fights against that so much, and he accuses it of being so awful. And I think at one point the guy says, this is just standard Hollywood. This is just standard procedure. He's trying to insinuate this is normal. Well, David Lynch is a director who clearly doesn't like that system. He's had issues with that during the main line of Twin Peaks. He had problems with the ABC studio and other people. He's had problems with that, obviously, in the sets of other films. We didn't get final cut. And you see him with Inland Empire in 2006, his last big project before the return in 2017. You see him with Inland Empire having the most freedom and the most flexibility possible. That he reveled in the idea of just taking this handheld camera, going to Poland, shooting whatever, and then actors just had to kind of find out the next, day by day what their script was. He enjoyed that sort of freedom. So we don't know, at least I don't know, what his mindset changed or how it went between 2006 and 2017. 11 years is a long time without a major project. But you bring a guy in who is known for wanting final cut, who is known for wanting time to experiment and the freedom to experiment. And at first, he only was going to get 9 episodes or 9 hours out of the return. He had to argue for that 18, right? You get him to on set, and he has to make this massive project, possibly the biggest cast he's ever worked with, the biggest production he's ever worked with, and it does have a deadline, and it does have a limited budget. I can see where that would create friction and frustration.
It's one of those cases where I know we've put up the example more so in the field of actors that did not make the final cut for the return and so on. But for examples that we brought up into the past on if David Lynch wanted it and with the scale that they've already been at, he could have probably gotten it. But it does show that there were a lot of give and take moments, at the very least from this, some keynote of those moments where David Lynch couldn't reach that sort of point. And David Lynch, if he had these more moments and this more time, there comes an innate curiosity of, if given that time in this hypothetical bubble with all these actors in all these ways and inside these spaces, what would things look like?
If he had spent that extra week at the Fireman's, what more content will we have involving that particular stuff? Because that's, I think a lot of people with the return would agree, that's some pretty important stuff with the Fireman. That is, some of the weirdest, most surreal, most seemingly thematically rich content coming out. And it's if he had more time to dream up more ideas, what would have changed? Would we ever have got the return if he got as much time as he wanted? How long would he have spent in each of these locations building each of these ideas? Could he have still done it in 18 hours? Or would it be a situation like The Missing Pieces where there's 18 hours of the return and there's 18 hours of missing pieces? Genuinely, I wonder, because Fire Walk With Me actually is not a bad one to bring in here, where I think he shot all of those scenes with the other actors intending to use them. But the studio was never going to let him do a 4-hour plus cut of Fire Walk With Me. It just wasn't going to happen at that time. So I think his eyes are bigger than his stomach sort of deal, where I think he had all these great ideas, he and Robert Engels, and they put them together in this way that if he could put all of it into one movie, it'd be just this massive, and I say bloated thing, because a lot of those missing pieces tonally do not fit with the dark tone of the final product we got in that movie. You and I have talked about it before, where if you were to reinsert all of these moments from the missing pieces into Fire Walk with Me, I question just how that would feel. It would change everything completely. But I think Lynch had all of these big ideas he wanted to do and ultimately couldn't. I'm glad the missing pieces got released, but if he would have got his way, we would have had a 4-hour movie that would have been really tonally dissonant.
I think that the big part about Fire Walk with Me that is interesting on how it came to be is that this would be a large endeavor for anybody who has worked in serialized media, for any sort of TV shows with the multiple venues that are being dealt with, and the sheer vastness of all the crew.
You're referring to Return right now, right?
The Return, yes.
Correct.
The sheer scope and scale of The Return, this 18-hour piece of media, and to have one directing force and idea coming from it, and however much Mark Frost and David Lynch worked together with the writing.
Well, and that's the question. If Mark Frost would have been more active in the production, could that have helped lighten the load? Could that have helped maybe work things out more smoothly? Yeah, it's all speculation.
It's all speculation. We only know that for serialized work, or at least I know from serialized work, is that David Lynch was juggling other projects with things such as Twin Peaks in the past.
And he also didn't have as much he had to do. He only directed a few episodes every now and then. Yes, he was consulted for ideas, and yes, he was involved to varying degrees, but he made the pilot, got a little bit of a break, made a few more episodes for season 1, got a little bit of a break while working on Wild at Heart, right? And then he comes back season 2, he does a few episodes here and there, but he wasn't 18 hours all at once.
The job of Atlas is not for everybody, and it's, again, surprising that this could even be put together in this format. Maybe people have other examples of different directors that for the first time, for their first big show release, they were able to do that. I still can't get over the fact this is a major managerial position to put anyone into.
Especially for someone like David Lynch who wants control.
Yes.
That is curious to me.
It is very curious. Well, another thing that's curious, and this is just more so realizing from any amount of production that makes me think about even the production as a whole with things such as practical effects later, but especially here, is they go into detail on how they shot the car crash scene with Mr. C in this, and how David Lynch is just working with all these people and just making sure that everything is in the clear, that everyone's safe, but also there's so many tiers that go into the production of it, but also what makes it very permanent is you see the vehicle, and then you have them say that they're aiming for the ramp, you see that he's packed inside there like a race car NASCAR driver with all these supports off to the side to make sure that he stays secure and safe inside this, and he flies off into the air, and they talk about the adrenaline afterwards. It's the car's damage and the fact that in this moment I realized, wait a second, they probably don't have 50 cars to retake this.
Right. Right. And David Lynch does believe in happy accidents. He does believe in some things just working out the way they need to. Yeah. And he's had tremendous success with that in the past.
Yep, so he's had tremendous success with that. And from how people are reacting to when the car fell and so on, and how that ended up perfectly, that sounds great. I'm wondering how many cases had to be owed to either time budget or whether or not the fact that it's a fucking car, you can't have 50 of those.
Right.
How many of those instances came up inside the Return sort of filming, you know? It only became more clear to me from a car. It's a weird thing to be more clear
on.
Now,
I would just say one of the takeaways that I had from this whole entire experience was just a continuously increasing respect and appreciation for anyone working on the effects department for the Return.
Yeah.
Whether it's making, the Renzo head, making the different creatures. I don't think we saw the experiment, being developed. That would have been really cool to see. But but seeing the different things that are being made, even just getting closer looks at Nido with the covering up on the face, that kind of stuff.
Yep, the covering up of the face,
sort of things.
And just making sure that those prosthetics were fitting. I don't know if it went into the experiment or anything, but the usage of things such as bread dough to mold into those little things.
I think those are really cool. I'm looking forward to seeing more of that, with the special features moving forward.
Yeah.
But I just think that's really cool because, there's a lot of work that goes into it, and including that stunt work with the car, that you have to just have these great artists on hand to make these weird ideas real, to take what David Lynch put on the script and Mark Frost and just take these abstract ideas and really bring them to life and work with someone who's very specific and very particular.
Yeah.
I think that's a great credit. And, I know that sometimes with The Return, it didn't win as many awards as some people might have wanted it to. Kind of got, some people would say, snubbed. I do hope that it got appropriate recognition for those who worked on the effects, and I hope that those people who worked on the effects in The Return were able to use that as a potential boon moving forward to other jobs.
It's well-deserved. I will praise the blood spatter pipes to heaven and beyond. I already have, and I'll do it again.
As a detractor of The Return, one of the things that kind of then was in my mind is how this might help me contextualize what happened that I don't necessarily like. So take this with a grain of salt that it's coming from this kind of, bias and
not
viewpoint.
A boulder, a grain.
A grain. I think I'm a little bit rational here, actually. I feel like what happened with The Return is that David Lynch had so many ideas that it got out of hand. And then as a result, The Return lost focus. I think that The Return feels more to me like an anthology of semi-connected little stories, but because there's so many, few of them got real development. And of course, there's obvious, things that can point out here. There's the Roadhouse conversations that often feel very disconnected from everything else. The Bing and Billy stuff with Audrey, the isolated moments with characters that don't go, quote, anywhere, that are continuously throughout. Even characters like the Detectives Fusco, where there's a little bit of behind-the-scenes stuff where they're talking about what are the names of these guys, and David Lynch is kind of frustrating the person he's talking to. And I don't know if it was Sabrina Sutherland or someone else, and I think it just said woman in the subtitle, but
it will be D.
He was like, they'll be D Fusco and T Fusco, but it's just this, it seems like he's kind of making up the names as he goes along, but I think of the Fuscos, and it's like, do I like the Detectives Fusco? And I'm like, well, they're kind of entertaining when they're on the screen, but I could not tell you hardly anything about them other than that they're kind of amusing. And even characters that, again, I like more, a lot of it's the performances, or it's maybe some context of the scenes they're in. I look at all these like little stories that could have been more. Hutch and Chantal, great performances, but I wish those characters were more. I'm interested in them. And I look at all this and it's like, I know from a script standpoint, when it comes to the screen, I keep feeling like these things, there's too much that's being spread apart. But now I've seen the production side, and I kind of think it goes hand in hand. That no wonder they were kind of brushing against these frustrations with their schedule when David Lynch had so many shooting locations, such a large cast to try to navigate, all within these like very specific amounts of time. If The Return had been more focused, if The Return had been pared down to maybe a slightly smaller scale to focus on a smaller number of characters, smaller number of scenarios, but really build on them, I think David Lynch would have had more time to dream. I think David Lynch would have had more time to experiment. But because they had to keep jumping to place to place to place, from person to person to person, I think that affected his ability to really go with those things. And in the end result, as a detractor, I personally feel like it made things not as full-bodied and developed as it could have.
It's the big question of whether or not, with like half the budget, would he have that more time to dream? Would it be potentially, you could argue for more of a budget for, say, for example, if it was put down to those 9 parts?
I'm curious what that would have looked like.
But there's also the matter of, say, for example, if David Lynch is just a dreamer by heart, that maybe it still was on the scale of all these multiple venues, and instead that's even stretched more into 9 parts, and then multiple people are just hoping to the gods that they don't have to worry about plaster of Paris. Plastering Paris.
Paris was never really that good of a character in Romeo and Juliet.
There was Paris as a character in Romeo and Juliet?
Well, he's the county of Paris.
Oh,
He was the guy who Juliet was supposed to marry.
Oh.
And he's like awkwardly older, but also it's the time period. So it's uncomfortable, but also it's the time period.
You see, it's weird that the first thing that goes into my head when it comes to the word Paris and character is Sweet Life of Zack and Cody, Paris Hilton.
Paris Hilton was engaged to marry Juliet for a variety of reasons. Didn't end up happening. At the time.
Including time.
Speaking of laughter, David Lynch has a good sense of humor with the staff and crew.
Good job, David Lynch.
Good job. A particular moment that I liked was the Sam and Tracy scene. Because if you're thinking about it from the actor's point of view, right? Sam and Tracy, they are 2 younger actors playing those characters. And I'm not sure, maybe they have an established catalog, maybe they don't know. But they're being asked to do a partial nudity love scene. makeout scene right before being eviscerated and being killed in a way that's kind of abstract because the thing that's killing them is obviously not there. It's not like Ike the Spike is, literally pushing against a wall and stabbing you with a prop. It's that you have to pretend you're being thrashed by an otherworldly experiment.
So what do you pretend? How do you pretend that you are getting thrashed? Well, clearly, it's to be thrashed by blue balls.
The fact that David Lynch, had this situation where he had to try to guide these two actors through, I would argue, a pretty difficult performance aspect, and how he navigated that was by being very straightforward, making sure that, people were kind of, it seemed like there was a respect kind of given toward the aspect of nudity had to be part of it, but let's try to make sure that the actors are still able to be as, clothed and comfortable as possible, given the parameters of the scene. But then also the sense of humor that the entire time he's referring to the thing that's going to pretend to be the experiment, basically the prop that they're using.
Yes.
It's the blue balls. And David Lynch, I think he's in on the joke. I think he's aware of what he's saying. That's definitely how I'm interpreting it. That he keeps saying like, and that's when I'm going to hit you with my blue balls. Like, it seems like he's well aware that he is disarming them and causing them to, kind of crack up and laugh. And you can see the two actors in the background finding this very funny. But he just keeps referring to them as
just
his
the
blue balls.
Just his blue balls he's just going to keep poking you with his blue balls.
And I think that is very funny.
I can agree to the statement that I believe that is very funny. We both find this scene very funny. Ha, 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 ha. Ha 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 ha.
So overall, with David Lynch as a director, if you were an actor, I know you do voice acting.
Yes.
But if you were actually auditioning for some sort of live action sort of stage performance thing with him,
yes,
for like a film or a show or whatever, how would you feel looking into it knowing that you're going to be auditioning for a David Lynch production? How would you feel knowing he's your director?
This is kind of a weird non-answer, I suppose, but it's something where I would kind of consider the situation, be like, oh, it'd be cool to be in this production. Let's see what happens. And then I do my little dance on stage and see whether or not David Lynch likes it.
Would you look forward to working with him, or would you be afraid?
I don't think fear would come through it. I think that I'd be excited to work with him, but I don't know which I wouldn't be excited for. I've always had this sort of like take where as long as it doesn't feel like I am going to be massacred by management, by blue balls with the management, it's not something where I'm going to be saying to everyone, hey everybody, I'm working with David Lynch, and then I do like 5 selfies. But it's also not going to be the case. It's like it'll be just like, oh, I'm excited to go to work tomorrow. This seems like it's going to be fun.
You think it'd be fun to work with him?
I think it'd be fun to work with him, but also I do recognize that I have a much more subdued reaction than other people who say, I don't
know if I can faint. I've never fainted before. That'd be the time where I would.
I don't know if there's a scenario I would faint, like for anybody.
I'm just saying that like I would be so overwhelmed with emotion. Obviously, I am not an actor. I'm not a performer. But if I was in a position where I could work with David Lynch in any capacity, under any circumstances, I would have like the positive version of a panic attack. I would be just so anxious and freaked out. But like I will say this, although I criticize, David Lynch and I question certain things about him, I have to keep emphasizing, because it may not be clear to people listening, David Lynch is my favorite director, and I love films. Like I love movies, and
what?
I know, and I've still not encountered a director that I would put higher than David Lynch for myself. It doesn't mean every single thing he's touched is gold to me, but I think he's one of the most interesting and innovative in the sense that when I see something David Lynch has made, especially a lot of his feature-length films where he did the script and the directing, it's something so different. There isn't anything quite like Mulholland Drive. There are other like neo-noirs. There are other films that, like maybe draw inspiration from. But even when I watch like Sunset Boulevard, it's not like I'm getting the exact same feeling. Lynch has such a signature style that, like other, famous creators like Kubrick or, Tarantino, where it when you see it. It's just something so specific. And I have a mad respect for David Lynch and just such appreciation that the idea of ever being in a situation of working with him, I would be living in a dream. Very much so myself.
We live inside a dream.
So I want to talk about some of the actors that were working with David Lynch and the ways in which they seem to react and respond, because I feel like there was different dynamics on display. That sometimes David Lynch would have a very different approach depending on who this was, especially for the returning actors that he's worked with, for decades potentially, either through multiple films or through Twin Peaks in the past. I find those dynamics so interesting to view.
Yes.
They're some of the most fun.
Yes.
What would you say for your sake when you were watching? What was the actor-director dynamic you were the most interested in?
I would say it was probably the actor dynamic that was with the actress for Diane.
Laura Dern.
Laura Dern, mostly because they have had a history for the longest period. I think.
Yeah, going back since Blue Velvet. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's about. Let's see. This was
only Kyle MacLachlan would be earlier.
This is like 30 years.
Yeah, because Kyle MacLachlan would be a little bit earlier with Dune.
Yeah.
But otherwise, I think Laura Dern would probably be the next.
Yeah. No. So.
Or Big Ed's actor also was in Dune, but you get the idea.
So kind of like seeing like this like otherworldly levity in the way that they sort of interact with each other when he says like, "I'm gonna put bread dough on your face and then I'm gonna stick a bloody finger in your mouth."
Yeah.
And they're just laughing and going with it for the longest time. Like it is actually like a painstaking sort of situation as like he's spraying the dough across. It's like, David, I need to breathe. It's like, oh yeah, I forgot that. You can tell like this
they're comfortable.
They are very comfortable with one another. And eventually, once this does go through, like, even Laura Dern returns the favor by smashing a bunch of dough on David Lynch's face, which, from what I know, they never used
No, that was never necessary. That was just for fun.
That was just for fun. It just seems like they have a good time bouncing off one another, and they are comfortable on the stage with one another, which is very good to see. It felt like a whole entire scene of wholesome.
Right, and I would say anytime you saw Kyle MacLachlan with David Lynch, it felt like the most comfortable as well, in the sense that I don't think that David Lynch or Kyle MacLachlan has to alter very much how they talk or how they act. They kind of just act natural is what it feels like to me. I mean, of course, I'm an outside observer guessing what their natural is, but I just watch them talking with each other. It just feels so fluid. And there's no pretensions.
I don't know how many people that when David Lynch says that you've done a great performance will dance like a penguin.
Yeah, it just seems like they're very, very, very cool with each other, which makes sense after all the times they've worked together. And how much Kyle MacLachlan was kind of a conduit as Dale Cooper for, David Lynch. Absolutely.
And don't forget Mr. C, Dougie, and Dougie in black suit.
Yeah, as well. I guess you could argue. That they're okay. I was meaning it more in the sense that Dale Cooper was almost a stand-in for David Lynch as the hero of Twin Peaks. But I guess also maybe Mr. C is a stand-in for David Lynch as the villain of Twin Peaks, and Dougie's a stand-in for David Lynch as the confused, weird, not sure what's going on.
I will run the joke to the ground, but since like Dougie in black suit is a different character to wrap up, what about him?
Sleaze?
The sleaze?
The sleaze? I don't know. Greasy, sleazy man.
He's David Lynch's inner
I guess
grease.
Mr. C probably has more grease. When you really get down to grease
He did say go take a shower after calling him away.
Yeah, he really did. For me, I think the most interesting to observe, not because necessarily it's the most wholesome, but just because it's the one I'm the most trying to understand, is how David Lynch interacts with Sherilyn Fenn, and that is Audrey's actor. And I don't know a ton about Sherilyn Fenn's kind of approach to acting and in general life. I only really know what we've researched for the Twin Peaks podcast. But she has been generally one of the more vocal members of the cast in the past. She was one that very strongly felt that Dale Cooper and Audrey should have been together. And she was very directly calling out Laura Flynn Boyle as the reason that didn't happen. Very much taking a stance that this was a dumb reason that got in the way of what would have been a great plot of these two characters.
I feel like both of these individuals, both David Lynch as well as Sherilyn Fenn, are types of individuals that will not let like the aspect of making something get in the way of like presenting how they feel. Like,
is this type A personality? Is that what you'd call this?
I don't know what that means.
Okay, well, I'm assuming it's type A, but they both, I think, have a very assertive, defined sense of what they want, and they have no qualms or reasons to hide that.
Is that the fucking A?
Yes.
Okay.
The type A personality. And so that's my interpretation, at least. When they're together, you have this very strange dynamic where they butt heads because they're both very stubborn and outspoken, but also there's a sort of parallel going on where maybe mutual respect is gained from the fact that they both are aware of that similarity. That's my read of two people I've never met and I do not know, and I am just going off of single interview footage. Like, I don't know, but that's how I read it.
They bounce off of each other, but sometimes that force is intensified. You can tell that they've had especially history when it comes to that, because they will have like different dynamics as they're like falling into like talking about the roles and sort of like digging into it. It's not a passive listening that Sherilyn Fenn does. She engages with it, questions it, plays with it, recognizes when like David Lynch will not say anything, but also will be remotely honest in the respects of like, I know what you were thinking when you were writing that.
I want to take all these things apart. So like, as she's sitting there, you know, on like this porch or something, and David Lynch is smoking, she bums a cigarette off of him, you know, please, can I have one, please, you know? And and they're talking, and they're generally, throughout this conversation, their tone is light. They're generally laughing. They're generally having a good time. But I get the sense that Sherilyn Fenn is trying to understand the context of her character, because Audrey in The Return is so disconnected from everyone else outside of Charlie that even if she was given the whole script of The Return, even if she was given everyone's parts, it wouldn't help her. Like, you got to think about her, like, being her role, right? You don't have any context for what your character's thinking and feeling. You don't even know the names of the characters you're talking about.
We see multiple points where David Lynch is talking about people's roles, and many a time are also on the phone. But I don't think I've seen as much bounce back and forth on, like, trying to dissect the character more than with David Lynch and Sherilyn Fenn.
I think a big part of it is that Sherilyn Fenn is looking for it. I get the sense she is grasping for any straws she can get.
Yeah.
She is trying to understand any context, and I think very understandably, given how abstract the role is, she doesn't know how she's supposed to feel when she says half her lines.
And I think it's in that sort of like comfortable zone with David Lynch. I can see like something as easily as sort of like brushing things away, but no, David Lynch is still trying to explore these things with her.
I don't agree, in the sense that I think he's pushing back as much as he can.
He's pushing back plenty, but he doesn't like stop the questions.
No, he doesn't stop the questions.
In fact, I think he starts to like encourage them more at certain points in the discussion.
That's a different read than I have, I guess. I feel that there's a wall between them that Sherilyn Fenn's trying to get through.
Trying to navigate, yes.
Trying to navigate. And at one point, yeah, she's about to ask a question, but she drops it and kind of like half mutters, you know, you wouldn't tell me anyway. Which, she's probably right. But also, that's a dynamic I haven't seen of other actors working with Lynch during this, 5-hour production.
Yeah.
The sort of very clear acknowledgement and almost accusation of like, you're not going to tell me anyway. And to say that to him, and he doesn't reply. He generally doesn't say much to anything here.
Yeah, no.
He just keeps smoking and kind of looking in the distance. He barely even looks at her.
He brings up portions and lines and sort of like a general idea for the most part.
And there's this part where Sherilyn Fenn is asking if Audrey is, I think the phrasing was, giving Charlie the business. And, David Lynch kind of nods and kind of agrees. And then Sherilyn Fenn takes that in a direction and says something like, just like I gave you the business. And she laughs and he laughs. I know where you wrote it from, you brat. And she shakes her head. And it's such a weird thing to try to read from the outside, not knowing them as people, because I could read it as kind of joking, but I can also read it as a little bit passive aggressive, because it's this sense of, I think what she's accusing, if I'm understanding,
yes,
is that she's accusing David Lynch of writing the character of Audrey to be like how he and her as real people, actor and director, have interacted. And I'm thinking what's being referenced here is that there's been rumors, and I think it might even be outright confirmed, but I don't have the source in front of me, that Sherilyn Fenn was not happy with the original script she was given for Audrey's character in The Return, and outright refused to do it otherwise, changes to be made. And this is where I don't know if it's ever 100% clear what the changes were, but she was not going to work on The Return until it was fixed. And I think she went to like social media to make sure that happened.
Yeah.
Like, she was very outspoken in that regard. And this is my theory. I don't know if it's been confirmed. My theory has been in the past, was Audrey's character originally going to be what Sylvia Horne was? Was she going to be in the Johnny scene, get assaulted and attacked by her son, left battered and bruised, and that was it? Because that's what my brain is kind of thinking may have been the case if Sherilyn Fenn wanted a bigger and less, awful role. Maybe that's what it was. I don't know that, but that's the closest thing I could think about, is maybe that's the change. I don't know. But what she got was very confusing. What she got was the Charlie stuff.
What she got was potentially an execution in Ghostwood Prison.
And so for Audrey's actor to say, that David Lynch, you're a brat. You're basing this character on me to you. You're calling me out for the way that I gave you the business and demanded this different role. That's why you're having Audrey demand these things of Charlie. And that gets even weirder when you look at the context that, I think it's in the same conversation, Sherilyn Fenn suggests that Audrey's character is a woman child or a child woman, like basically not fully mature, not fully in her senses as an adult, but acting childish. And David Lynch agreed. Well, if she's right and David Lynch is basing the Audrey character off of Sherilyn Fenn, is that not potentially him saying that Sherilyn Fenn is like a woman child? Like, this is where I think their dynamic is so weird because I can't tell if they're angry with each other. I can't tell if they're just two good friends, bumming cigarettes, talking about the role, everything's hunky-dory, or if Sherilyn Fenn is like, I'm onto you, you're using me in real life as inspiration, and we're fighting.
Or how far it goes onto the temperature stick, the Venn diagram, however, like, you want to metaphorize the blending of these realms.
Do you get where I'm coming from? Like, when you were watching it, did you sense potential animosity?
I sensed the complication, but I did sense a friendly air about them. Not to say that they don't have these sort of, like, points and hang-ups, but it's one of those cases that I didn't feel Audrey was grinding her heel into David Lynch, but more so sort of like giving the elbow to.
It's such an interesting tension.
It is.
Yeah. And then later we do get to see some shootings with the Charlie scene. And this is like the end year story. It's like Ghostwood scene with Charlie. And throughout this, beginning of it, David Lynch is whispering words into Sherilyn Fenn's ear.
It's not leaving Sherilyn Fenn's ear.
Well, it's so interesting because nowhere else I think that happens. Like generally the things he gives like words to the actors, it's just out loud. This is stuff that he is only telling to her.
From that, what we've seen from the special features, yes.
Yes. But that's what I'm saying is that the special features are pretty all-encompassing. So this seemed, from what we saw, really weird.
We didn't see the daughter of Bobby, where potentially he's whispering in her ear inside of the car and be like, look into the sky and see God.
Okay, good.
So
yeah, it's
that could have happened.
Completely possible. I also want to just quickly note that for Charlie's actor, his name was Clark Middleton. I thought, and this is what I'm kind of questioning to you, when you watched The Return, did you think he was about the same height as Audrey, or did you think he was smaller in stature?
I think I was small in stature, but also in the bonus features, that thought still remained with me. I just assumed that he might have just been on an incline or anything like that from the complications of the home.
No, I think it's just that we never see them stand together very much. And when we do, it might be shot at certain angles or done with certain effects. But between, maybe it's the clothing looked bigger or something. I feel like there was a concerted effort to make him look shorter in The Return than he really was, which raises all sorts of questions because the closest analog we have to a very short man would be Man from Their Place. And that obviously has so many implications for whatever's going on with Audrey here. So I just thought that was interesting seeing the real actor in these shots and being like, oh, wow, okay, so he doesn't actually look that short in the real life. That is interesting to me.
Yeah, it's the magic of movies.
The magic of movies. Speaking of magic, Grace Zabriskie, playing a character probably more cursed than any sort of positive magic in the form of Sarah Palmer.
Gifted and the damned.
I would be so interested to see behind-the-scenes footage of David Lynch with Grace Zabriskie during Wild at Heart, to see what he coached her through with that role. But it seems like with this role, he takes on such a more supportive, quiet cadence.
Emphasis on quiet.
Versus anyone else. And their dynamic is just so curious where, one of the first things that's said is you hear Grace Zabriskie kind of half muttering, animals eating each other. Yeah, it's my kind of stuff. And it's just like she's maybe method acting, maybe getting really in the character, but the way that she's kind of talking semi in the Sarah Palmer personality, self-identifying as that's my kind of stuff. And then both of them very cryptic at certain points with each other. And David Lynch says that with the strange, scene coming up, it's going to be a bit strange. It's going to be a bit weird. He's almost like prepping her for it. And he says that you're going to sense it's in God's hands, which I'm curious what that means to, what does that mean to Grace Zabriskie when he says that to her? What is the implication? Because I'm almost thinking I'm not going into lore brain. I don't think David Lynch is spoiling that God is in Twin Peaks and it's related to Sarah Palmer. No, I think it's the way he's explaining it to her.
Are you sure? Like, this might be the emphasis of that's where she gets her next DVD. God's hand just comes down with the next volume.
Right, of boxing.
Boxing and animal death,
Boxing,
Part 5.
30-second loop on a disc.
God has a very unique collection of DVDs.
And he like runs through the scene. She's going to run out of alcohol. She's going to go to the bar. And he's just so tender and reassuring. And then at the end, he reassures her that he loves her very much. Mm-hmm. And the whole mood of those two talking, it's kind of entrancing. Because it's not like anything else. And it makes me wonder so much about their dynamic. Both in the original series as well as Wild at Heart, Inland Empire, when she was the neighbor character. Grace Zabriskie is kind of a catalyst for some strange and otherworldly, like, mediums, almost. Like, all of them are very spiritually charged, but in a very unsettling kind of way. And maybe Wild at Heart isn't so much spiritually, but I do kind of get I don't know, I get a certain sense of a certain otherworldliness out of her character, too, in there.
She's challenged as well. And I think that, like, this, like, softer nature, or at the very least from how dark the scene is, shows, at the very least in the moment, a very much a heavy acknowledgement on his responsibilities, and I think he handles them very well. Some people in very dark moments will probably try to lean into the fear, but I think that David Lynch tries to keep her centered. Right.
And she has such a heavy role that she might very much need that support. She probably has, I mean, if not the darkest role in The Return, definitely in the top, like, 3. And then I know you're a fan of bards. I know you're a D&D kind of guy. You like bards conceptually.
I'm also conceptually a very big fan of instruments that are just traditionally not used as much as other instruments, and a mandolin was broken out.
So David Patrick Kelly, the actor who plays Jerry Horn, has some very fun, I would say, interactions with David Lynch.
Very high energy.
They reunite like good old friends, good humored. David Patrick Kelly's like, I look the same as I did 25 years ago, right? Like, with this big white beard, obviously one of the most changed actors there. And they just seem to get along really well. But there's this moment of reprieve, either between shootings or at the end of shootings. And you have David Patrick Kelly bringing out this mandolin and singing an Irish folk song called The Lass of Aughrim.
With heavy vibrato, and from what I understand and from what we've seen, we listen to it in its entirety as it's being played on the mandolin.
No editing, nothing cutting away.
On the trees, and it's just peaceful.
And I will say, for those who do not have the special features or can't get a hold of this, it is on YouTube. So if you look at David Patrick Kelly, Lass of Aughrim, you can find this scene on there currently.
Don't tell Showtime and or CBS. We need to keep that up as long as we can. It's just between you and me, listener.
And in fact, I would go as far as to say that if only one moment from this 5-hour documentary could find its way to YouTube, that's the one I'd want.
Absolutely.
That would be the one that I want. Not because it's the most revealing, not because it's the most, evocative of Twin Peaks lore and David Lynch's mindset, but because it's just such a moment in time. It's just such a feeling of stillness and perfection between two old friends and sharing something beautiful between them.
I agree.
So I often share with you, Professor, something called a wonderful and strange question of the week.
Yep, and I got them right every time.
And I have one for you. Again. And I will say, for listening audience, for full disclosure, I did give you a few hours heads up on this one, just because it's a little more broad.
I was going to look so much more oppressive.
Oppressive. You would have looked like a dictator. So my question for you is that with all these interviews we've been encountering recently with special features and are going to keep encountering, if you could spend 1 hour interviewing any Twin Peaks cast or crew member, living or someone who's passed away, and you could do that interview in any Twin Peaks shooting location, whether it's a set or an outdoors area, whatever, you could do it in that shooting location for an hour with that actor or cast and crew member. Who would you pick and why? And where?
Jack Nance walking up the river from the earliest scene in Twin Peaks.
So him by the big old log wrapped in plastic or on the dock overlooking where he fishes?
By the big old log walking up the river.
Okay.
I not only want to know something Not only would it be just great to just have a nice conversation with someone who's worked with David Lynch for so long and also has been acting himself for so long through all these roles and so on, what could be enlightened from the relationships, friendships, or perhaps even enemyships to other individuals that he's come across to know in his life. But I can't help but want something that I know I can't have. Having that opportunity to pluck someone from a timeline, to have a moment with them that is beyond any rarity that you have the chance for now. There is an honest temptation with that. I'd love to know these bits of information that sadly we only have so limited information on now. There may be some chance I come across one of these actors at conventions or inside of travels or through some other means and ends, but I will never find Jack Nance again. I won't truly know Jack Nance outside of the interviews he's already had up till this day. And he seems like someone very much down to earth that I would enjoy a conversation walking down a river with.
I think it's a fantastic answer.
Thank you.
Good job.
I did it.
You did it.
I did it again.
Now, listener, we are winding down to our final few episodes of this podcast. And I would like to hand the reins of control and power over to you.
Oh, not me?
I'm going to do it for one episode and then it's gone. No, Professor, you don't get No. I mean, do you want to ask me a wonderful and strange question next time?
Not really.
Well, then.
I just want the power.
Screw you!
The power and no responsibility.
So, you get all the power and no responsibility, listener, unless you want the responsibility. I don't know, whatever you want to do. We would love to receive your wonderful and strange question of the week to feature in our last episode, the curtain call, which is going up at the end of March, meaning we're going to be recording it probably in the middle-ish of March. So the sooner we can get your questions or theories on Twin Peaks or hot takes or just things that we might have missed, the sooner we can get those, the more likely it is that it can actually show up in the episode. So if you're listening to this and you have a question, theory, or hot take, or something we missed, we would love for you to send that to us via email at snakeeyedreams@gmail.com. And if you want to type that as text, a simple text question, that's cool. You can even put, if you want it to be anonymous, I will not say anything about who said it. I'll just say a listener said this. But if you want to go the opposite direction and you want to record yourself asking it, we'll feature your audio as well.
I'd love to hear your wonderful, strange questions of the week and also be completely correct on to them. Thank you very much, listeners.
Alternatively, you could tweet at us at SnakeEyeDreams1. That's the numeral 1, as in one more option for you would be to post it in a YouTube comment to this episode right here, right now, or at a time of your convenience. Lastly, if you are listening to this and you want to be part of this process, but you don't really have a question for us, one thing that we could ask you for, that we'd also be interested in, is that in Twin Peaks: The Return, a major idea, especially for Margaret Lanterman, is that Laura is the one. I want to know, what do you think that means?
This is a wonderful and strange question for you. Specifically you. Not for me.
Specifically you?
You.
You there with the Oreos in the kitchen counter? Not on, in the counter. I know that you drilled open your counter, you put them in there like the heart from that Edgar Allan Poe story, and the Oreos, the sound of them beating, still keeps you up at night.
And you thought
they're watermelon flavor.
And you thought you could hide it under the spice rack, but it's still there.
Still there. Speaking of spice rack, the next flavor we're going to be trying out next week, and it's actually next week, by the way. It's not every other week. We're actually uploading this next week. If all goes well, fingers crossed.
Fingers crossed.
Check next Sunday.
Do it.
It's Behind the Curtain, which is featured on discs 9 and 10 of the Z-Day collection. And if you're following along and you want to experience this for yourself, it is 7 hours and 43 minutes approximately, so strap yourself in for a tremendous amount of behind-the-scenes footage. Again, I have never heard of this before. It is outrageous. I am sure in some places it is illegal to have this much special features behind-the-scenes footage.
Consume.
Lap it up like the Garmin Bosia. Or bite into it politely like a nice little cherry pie. Perfect.